Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere strange. We are going somewhere where the great gilded rooms of the 18th century are full of the most expensive furniture in Europe, where the courtiers wear silks that cost a labourer's annual wage to make, where the meals run to 20 courses on plates of silver, and where, behind all of the gold leaf and the painted ceilings and the ceremonial dignity, the principal occupants of the building cannot, on the whole, stand the sight of one another. We are going to the court of the early Hanoverian kings of Britain. We are going to a specific house in that court on a private day in the spring of 1736, when a modest ship was making its way up the Thames toward Greenwich, carrying a 16-year-old German princess who had never seen England, who knew almost nothing of the language spoken there, and who was, by the plain painted miniature she had been shown a few weeks earlier, going to marry a man she had never met. She did not know, on this April morning, very much about her future husband beyond what the minor portrait had told her. She did not know very much about the family she was about to join. She did not know very much about the country she was about to live in for the rest of her life. She knew only that the carriage that would meet her at the dock would take her to St. James's Palace, that she was expected to perform the ceremonies that would in due course make her the wife of the Prince of Wales, and that this was, by the long arrangements of her own family in Saxe-Gotha, and the longer arrangements of European dynastic politics in general, simply what a princess of her rank did. Her name was Augusta. She was the daughter of the Duke of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, who had died when she was a baby, and of his second wife, who had raised Augusta and her many siblings in the modest court of a very little German principality that no one in Britain had ever paid much attention to. Augusta was, before her marriage, the sort of princess whom the European royal marriage market produced in considerable quantities, brought up in the certain knowledge that she would in due course be married to whatever suitable prince the family's negotiations could secure, and trained, in her education, principally in the brief accomplishments that a married princess would need. She danced. She played a little. She spoke fluent German, as one would expect, and a modest amount of French, which was the international language of the European courts, and almost no English, because she had not, until the marriage was arranged, been given any distinct reason to learn it. The marriage had been arranged, after some years of negotiation, by the British King George II, who had been on the throne for 9 years, and who was the husband of Queen Caroline, and who had a personal interest in seeing his eldest son and heir, the Prince of Wales, settled into the sort of marriage that would produce children, and would, with luck, produce a less troublesome version of his son than the version he currently had. The Prince of Wales was 28 years old in 1736. He had been living in England for 8 years, having come over from Hanover only after his parents had been on the British throne for a year, and after his grandfather, George I, had died. The arrangements by which the prince had been left behind in Hanover, for 14 years of his early life, separated from the parents who had moved to London without him in 1714, and seen by them only on the rare occasions when one or another of them returned to Hanover for a state visit, are part of the sharp Hanoverian story we will come to in due course. The prince in 1736 had spent 8 years in his father's English court, and the 8 years had not gone well, and the marriage to Augusta was, in part, his father's attempt to stabilize his son into a mode of life that the father might find easier to manage. Augusta did not know any of this. Augusta was, on the April morning when her ship was coming up the Thames, simply a young woman doing what her family had told her to do, and feeling, by all accounts, quite reasonably nervous about it. We are with her on the ship. The ship is not a large ship. It is a yacht of the British royal household, sent to Helvoetsluis in the Netherlands to collect her from the faint overland party that had brought her from Saxe-Gotha to the Dutch coast, and the yacht has crossed the North Sea, and entered the Thames estuary in the narrow hours of the morning, and is now, in the early light, making its way up the river past the simple towns and villages of Kent toward Greenwich, where she will land. She has been, for the previous 4 days at sea, mostly in the limited cabin that has been arranged for her, with her German waiting woman beside her, with the little box of her personal possessions strapped to the deck, with the cold of the North Sea in spring producing in her the spare, steady seasickness that the journey has, by all accounts, been mostly a slow recovery from. She is this morning on deck. She has been told that they are now in the Thames, and that she will in a few hours see the dome of St. Paul's rising in the distance, and beyond it the spires and roofs of London. She has wrapped a heavy cloak around her shoulders. She is leaning against the rail. She is watching the brown water of the river slide past the ship, with the restrained flat green shore of Kent on one side, and the modest flat green shore of Essex on the other, and she is trying, in her own quiet way, to begin the work of preparing herself for what is going to happen next. What is going to happen next, although she does not know the details yet, is approximately this. The yacht will dock at Greenwich. A carriage will be waiting. She will be taken, with her waiting woman and a plain selection of her boxes, up the road through the South London villages to Lambeth, across the river by the New Bridge, and through the streets of Westminster to St. James's Palace. At the palace she will be received by the King and the Queen. She will be presented to her future husband. She will be allowed a few days to recover from the journey in apartments that have been prepared for her, with attending women, supplied from the Queen's own household. There will be, in the days that follow, a great deal of ceremony. She will, at the appointed hour, be taken in procession to the Chapel Royal at St. James's, where she will be married to the Prince of Wales according to the rites of the Church of England, with the King and Queen and the assembled court watching. There will be that evening the public bedding ceremony, in which the new bride and groom dressed in their nightclothes will be conducted through the palace by a minor procession of court officials and put into the royal bed, with the curtains of the bed drawn and the little ceremony of the bedding witnessed, in some vestigial form, by the most senior members of the court before they withdraw and leave the couple to themselves. This is, in its broad outline, what will happen. She has been told in general terms that this is what will happen. She has not been told by anyone in her family or by the diplomats who arranged her marriage very much about the brief additional details that will, in the course of the next several days, accumulate around her. She does not know, for example, that her future husband and his father are not on the whole on speaking terms. She does not know that the Queen, her future mother-in-law, has, in private letters she has written, but that no one has shared with Augusta, expressed her intense dislike of her son in language that, in any other family, would be considered shocking. She does not know that her future husband has been for some years conducting his political life in active opposition to his father's government, that his household at Leicester House on the other side of London has become a kind of opposition court to his parents' court at St. James's, and that her marriage to him is, in the eyes of many of the people she is about to meet, a kind of strategic placement of a young woman from a friendly minor German state into a household that the King hopes she will, by her presence, somehow stabilize. She does not know that the King, who arranged this marriage, is 40 years older and harder than the man she is going to meet would have been a few years ago, and that the Queen, her future mother-in-law, who also arranged this marriage, is a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable bitterness, whose views about her own son she is not, on the whole, going to share with the new daughter-in-law. She does not know any of this. She is, on the April morning, simply a young woman watching the brown water of the Thames go past, with her faint store of practical advice from her own mother in her head, and her narrow store of language lessons in English that she has been working at over the past several months, and her simple store of the religious instruction she received as a child to fall back on, and not very much else. The court of her future parents-in-law is, in less than 30 hours' time, going to begin to assemble itself around her. The next 36 years of her life are going to take place inside that court, or in the limited parallel courts that the family will set up for her. She has not, on this morning, the smallest notion of what is in front of her. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Tonight we are going to follow Augusta from this April morning on the Thames, through her marriage and her children, and the fast end of her husband, and the widowhood that came after, into her late years as the mother of one British king, and the mother-in-law of his queen, and finally to the spare bedchamber at Carlton House, where, in February 1772, with her son the king sitting beside the bed, the story will end. I am glad you are with me. There are more evenings of this kind to come. And before we go further into Augusta's story, we have to go back, briefly, to the house she was about to enter. By the standards of European royal dynasties of that period, it was an unusually difficult one. The trouble was specific. Fathers and sons in this line had a habit of turning against one another. The Hanoverian family had come to the British throne in 1714 on the death of Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch. The man who came to the throne was George I, who was at the time 54 years old, who had been the Elector of Hanover in northwestern Germany for over a decade, who spoke poor English, who had never been to Britain before he came to be its king, and who brought with him, in a kind of awkward bundle, the entire restrained German court of Hanover, including his German mistresses, his German advisers, his German cooks, and the various modest accumulated cultural habits of 40 years of living in a plain German court. Unto he did not bring his wife. His wife had been, in fact, divorced from him for 20 years by the time he came to the British throne, and she was, at the time of his accession, in confinement in a castle in northern Germany where she had been kept since the divorce, and where she would remain until her death many years later. The reasons for the divorce and the long confinement are not, on the whole, the reasons that the British public was given when they were told that their new king's wife would not be coming to England. The reasons that the British public was given were vague. The reasons that historians have since worked out involved a young woman who had been desperately unhappy in her arranged marriage, a Swedish count who had been, by all accounts, the principal love of her life, a series of letters and assignations that her husband's spies had documented, the Swedish count's eventual disappearance under circumstances that no one in the family ever satisfactorily explained, and the divorce that followed. The wife was 30 when she went into the castle. She was 60 when she died there. The son she had borne her husband, who was the future George II, had been 11 years old when his mother was taken away, and had not seen her again for the rest of her life. This is the family that came to Britain in 1714. The new king arrived with his 31-year-old son, who would in due course succeed him as George II, and the son's wife Caroline, who was 29, and the son's 3 minor daughters. The son's eldest child, however, the 7-year-old Frederick, who was the future Prince of Wales whom Augusta was now coming to England to marry, was left behind in Hanover. The reasons for leaving the boy behind have been debated by historians ever since. The official reason was that Hanover required a senior member of the family to remain there to represent the dynasty, and that the little boy, although too young to actually govern, would serve as the symbolic presence around whom the Hanoverian regents could organize their work. The unofficial reasons, which the contemporary letters and gossip make easier to see, included a deeper political calculation by the new king, who did not entirely trust his son and daughter-in-law, and who wanted, by keeping the eldest grandson in Hanover, to retain a certain leverage over them, that the geography of separation provided. Whatever the reasons, the boy stayed in Hanover when his parents and his sisters left for England. He was 7. He stayed until he was 21. The 14 years he spent without his immediate family were the formative years of his life. He was raised by a series of court tutors and household officials in the apartments of the Hanover Palace where his great-grandmother had lived in her old age, with the little Hanoverian court that had not gone to Britain reorganizing itself around him. He saw his father once, on a single state visit in 1716. He saw his mother once, on the same visit. After that visit, his parents went back to England. He saw neither of them again for the rest of that period of his separation. He wrote letters to them. They wrote letters back. The letters were polite and formal, and contained in their accumulated record very little of the actual emotional substance of a parent-child relationship. The boy grew up, in effect, an orphan, with parents who were alive but not present. He was not unhappy. He was not, according to those around him, particularly happy either. He was simply, in the way of children who grow up in unusual circumstances, the sort of person those circumstances produce. He developed certain local tastes. He liked music. He learned to play several instruments, including the cello, with considerable competence. He read, in German and in French, more widely than most Hanoverian princes of that period had been encouraged to read. He developed a sense of personal style that was somewhat at odds with the rather plain Hanoverian taste of his grandfather. He spent in Hanover his teenage years and his early 20s, and he became, by his late teens, a young man who was looking forward to being recalled to England and joining the family he had been separated from for so long. The recall did not come quickly. Even after his grandfather's death in 1727 and his father's accession to the throne, Frederick was not immediately summoned. His father, the new King George II, was in no specific hurry to bring his eldest son to England. His mother, Queen Caroline, was, at this stage, still mostly inclined to let the matter rest. Frederick continued to live in Hanover for another year. He turned 21 in early 1728. Only in December of that year, 14 years after his parents had originally left him behind, did the recall finally come, and he travelled to England in the company of a brief German party to take up the position of Prince of Wales that had at this point been vacant since his birth. When he arrived in London, he met his parents for the first time as an adult. The meeting did not go well. The parents were strangers to him, and he was a stranger to them, and the gap between what each had been imagining about the other for the previous 14 years and what each actually was when they met in person was by all accounts considerable. Frederick had been imagining, in part, a homecoming. His parents had been imagining, in part, a young man who would be tractable and easily managed. Neither imagination matched the reality. The young man who had come over from Hanover was a confident, somewhat theatrical, somewhat self-consciously cultivated person of 21, with his own ideas about his position and his own circle of associates and his own habits of life that he was not, on the whole, prepared to set aside in deference to the family he barely knew. Within a year of his arrival, the relationship between Frederick and his parents had started to deteriorate. Within 2 years it was openly bad. Within 5 years it had become the principal feature of the public political life of the country, with the king and the prince actively opposed to one another, with the queen siding with her husband and against her son with a vehemence that was, by the standards of even the more fraught aristocratic families of that period, remarkable. Letters between the Queen and her closest confidants, which have survived in considerable quantities, contain expressions about her son so harsh that the modern reader, encountering them for the first time, has difficulty believing they were written by his mother. She called him, in one letter, the greatest beast in the world, and said that his lies were so frequent and so without reason that they had ceased to surprise her, and that the more she saw of him, the less she liked him. The letters went on in this vein, year after year, through a relationship that never recovered. The reasons for the bitterness were several and overlapping. There was the simple fact of the long separation, which had given each side a fixed mental picture of the other, that the actual person, when finally met, could only disappoint. There was the political element, in which Frederick, denied any meaningful share in his father's government, gathered around himself a faint circle of opposition politicians who used him as a kind of front for their attacks on his father's ministers. There was the financial element, in which Frederick believed himself entitled to a larger annual allowance from the civil list than his father was prepared to grant him, and in which the years of negotiations over this allowance produced an accumulated bitterness on both sides. There was, beneath all of this, a kind of personal incompatibility that no specific cause adequately explains. The father did not like the son did not like the father. The mother sided with the father, with a vehemence that suggested that she found in her son something that she could not forgive, although the precise nature of what she could not forgive is, in spite of the volume of her surviving letters, never quite clear. The court of the Hanoverian kings, by the time Augusta came to it in 1736, was a court divided down its middle by this family quarrel. The king and queen held court at St. James's Palace, with the official ceremonies of the British monarchy, and the narrow German habits of the Hanoverian household combined into the somewhat awkward synthesis that the previous 22 years had produced. The Prince of Wales held a parallel court at Leicester House, in what was then a separate part of the city, where he gathered around himself the limited group of opposition politicians, opposition writers, opposition wits, and various courtiers who had decided that their long-term prospects lay with the heir rather than with the reigning king. The two courts, although they were the courts of a single family, were not, on the whole, on good terms. People who attended one were watched suspiciously by the other. The king occasionally made a point of refusing to receive members of his son's circle at his own court. The son occasionally made a show of being more polite to opponents of his father's government than the politeness of any private feeling required. The whole arrangement had the simple theatrical quality of a long family quarrel that had moved out of the household into the national life of the country. This was the family Augusta was about to marry into. This was the family the king and queen had selected her for, on the assumption that a young, modest, biddable German princess from a minor court would, by her presence, help to settle her future husband into a less troublesome version of himself. It is an assumption that, looking back at it from any distance, seems to have been founded on the most superficial reading of what was actually wrong in the family. The trouble was not, on the whole, that the prince needed a wife. The trouble was that the prince and his parents could not stand each other, and a wife was unlikely, by any reasonable expectation, to fix that. But the king and queen had chosen Augusta. The negotiations had been concluded. The marriage had been agreed. Augusta was, on the April morning of 1736, on her ship coming up the Thames, with no real understanding of what she was sailing into. The yacht was approaching the dock at Greenwich. The carriages were waiting. The next 36 years of her life were about to begin. The dock at Greenwich, when the yacht came alongside it on that April morning, was already crowded. Word had got out, by the limited communications networks that the river towns ran on, that the new princess was arriving, and the modest crowd that gathered on the dock to watch her come ashore was, by the accounts of those who saw it, in a generally good mood. The British public in the early 18th century had not entirely warmed to the Hanoverian royal family. The kings spoke poor English. The kings preferred Hanover. The kings, by their evident interest in their German territories rather than in their British ones, gave the impression of being, in some sense, foreigners on their own throne. But a new princess arriving from Germany to marry the heir was the sort of spare dynastic event that could be received by the public with a kind of provisional goodwill. She was young. She was, by the restrained reports that had preceded her, modest in her manners and not unattractive in her appearance. She might, with luck, give the heir the children that the dynasty needed. The crowd at the dock was on these grounds willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. She came down the gangplank in a green silk dress, with her German waiting woman behind her, and a modest group of British court officials assembled in front of her on the dock. The senior of these was the master of ceremonies of the royal household, an elderly man whose principal job on this morning was to hand her into the waiting coach and make sure that the journey to St. James's Palace went without incident. Bowed, she curtsied. Words were exchanged in French, since neither party spoke the other's first language with any fluency. The master of ceremonies indicated the vehicle. She walked, with her close group, across the dock. A footman opened the door. She was helped inside. The waiting woman climbed in beside her. The door was shut. The coach moved off. The journey from Greenwich to Westminster took, by the standards of 18th century travel, the better part of 3 hours. The roads through the South London villages were in their usual indifferent condition. The coach was new and well sprung, but its springs were not enough on those roads to entirely smooth the journey. Augusta sat inside, looking out of the modest window at a landscape that was unfamiliar to her, with her waiting woman beside her, and she said, by the later testimony of the waiting woman, very little. She watched the plain fields go past. She watched the minor villages. She watched the river when the road came near it. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not, in any visible way, weep or display any other emotion that the journey might have produced. She was, according to those who were there, composed in the manner expected of a young woman in her circumstances, with her training in court manners holding firm against whatever private feelings the morning had produced. When the carriage reached St. James's Palace and pulled into the inner courtyard, the King and Queen were waiting in one of the smaller reception rooms to receive her. The Prince of Wales, her future husband, was also in the room. She had not, of course, met any of them. She was being shown into the presence of the 3 principal members of her future immediate family for the first time, and she was being shown in by the master of ceremonies who had collected her to perform the ceremonies of greeting that the etiquette of the occasion required. She did, by all accounts, perform the ceremonies correctly. She curtsied to the king, who took her hand and kissed it. She curtsied to the Queen, who embraced her in a brief formal embrace. She curtsied last and most deeply to the Prince of Wales, who kissed her hand and said the faint few words of welcome that the moment required. The waiting court watched. The whole exchange, by the accounts of those who were present, lasted perhaps 2 minutes. At the end of it, the Queen led Augusta out of the room and through a series of corridors to the apartments that had been prepared for her, where her boxes were already arriving, and where the women of the Queen's household were waiting to begin the work of helping her to dress for the formal court reception that would follow that evening. The marriage took place on the 27th of April 1736, 8 days after Augusta's arrival in England. The ceremony was held in the Chapel Royal at St. James's, with George II, Queen Caroline, and the assembled guests watching, while the Archbishop of Canterbury presided. Augusta wore a dress of silver tissue with a long train that the ladies of her new household had been preparing for her in the days since her arrival. She made her vows in English, which she had been practicing during the 8 days, and which she pronounced, according to those who heard her, with the slightly heavy German accent that would remain a feature of her speech. Frederick, beside her at the altar, made his vows in the fluent English of a man born in Hanover and brought up there, but long enough in Britain to master the language of his adopted country. The ceremony lasted about an hour. The procession back through the palace afterwards was shorter. The state dinner that followed lasted some hours. The bedding ceremony that ended the day was truncated by the standards of both the English and German traditions, but it followed the essential outline. Bride and groom, in their nightclothes, were conducted to the bedchamber. The senior officers watched them get into bed. The curtains were drawn. The attendants withdrew. The marriage of Augusta of Saxe-Gotha and Frederick, Prince of Wales, was in the formal sense complete. We do not know what either of them said to the other in the bedchamber after the curtains were drawn. We know, from observations over the next several days, that Frederick was in a generally good mood and treated his new wife with kindness and consideration, and that Augusta appeared to be settling into her circumstances with the composed manner that had characterized her arrival. Within a few months, observers were describing her as sensible and pleasant, making a creditable effort at her new role. George II, who had hoped the marriage would settle his son into something resembling domestic stability, judged in those first weeks that matters were going about as well as could be expected. What none of the observers knew, on those first weeks of April and May, 1736, was how the marriage would actually develop, what kind of children it would produce, how short Augusta's first life as the wife of a Prince of Wales would actually turn out to be, and how long the second life that followed it would be. The marriage was beginning. The story was beginning. The young woman in the silver tissue dress, who had arrived 8 days ago on a yacht from Helvoetsluis, was now, in the eyes of the British court and the British public, the new Princess of Wales, with all the uncertain duties and prospects that the position carried. She would hold the position for the next 15 years. After that, she would hold a different and even more uncertain position for the 21 years that followed. The marriage between Augusta and Frederick, in spite of the difficult family politics that surrounded it, settled itself remarkably quickly into a kind of working domestic partnership that surprised, by its evident warmth, several of the contemporary observers who had been expecting the young German princess to be a difficult fit. Frederick, who had not chosen his bride and who had been told, until the marriage was concluded, only the simple formal facts of her family and her education, found in his 16-year-old wife a quiet companionship that he had not had in his life before. He had no private reason to expect that the marriage would produce affection, given how few royal marriages of that period produced affection, and given his own tendency to expect disappointment from the various arrangements his parents had made for him. He found, however, that the young woman who had come up the Thames in the green silk dress was, in her actual private character, considerably more interesting than the limited reports had suggested she would be. She was intelligent. She was, in her quiet way, observant. She had, in spite of her sheltered upbringing in the spare Saxe-Gotha court, a kind of native good sense about people that the more sophisticated observers who came to Leicester House in the early years of the marriage frequently remarked on with surprise. She was, in addition, willing to make the marriage work in the practical daily ways that mattered. She did not complain about her husband's evening political occupations. She did not complain about the long late hours that his public role kept demanding. She did not complain, when complaint would have been justified, about the various restrained inconveniences and humiliations that his ongoing quarrel with his parents kept producing in their domestic life. She was, in her modest, composed way, the sort of wife that Frederick, given the opportunity, would probably have selected for himself if he had been in a position to do the selecting. He had not been in that position. The marriage had been arranged for him, but the arrangement had, by the plain accidents of personal compatibility that royal marriages so rarely produced a relationship that became, over the 15 years it lasted, the most stable emotional fact of either of their lives. Frederick was by all accounts faithful to her, which was unusual for princes of his rank in the period. He consulted her in his private decisions with a frequency that the courtiers around him noticed with some surprise. He sought her opinion on the little political questions that the household kept producing. He was, in their private hours together, more affectionate with her than the public version of him would have led an outside observer to predict. Augusta, for her part, came over time to develop for her husband a kind of patient, affectionate loyalty that the difficult parts of his character did not particularly disturb. She knew that he was, in many of his dealings with the wider world, a difficult and sometimes disingenuous man. She was, in her own internal life, capable of holding both judgments about him simultaneously, which is the sort of capacity that long marriages tend, over time, to develop in their participants. She was, when he died in the brief evening collapse of 1751, a real widow rather than a relieved one. The grief that she did not display in public in the hours and days after his death was real enough in private that her closest attending women, who saw her in the faint unguarded moments of the early widowhood, recorded in their letters to friends and family that the dowager princess had, by her own quiet standards, been more shaken by the loss than any of the public observers had expected she would be. We are at the beginning of all of this on the night of the 27th of April 1736, with the curtains of the bedchamber drawn and the court officials departed, and the long quiet of the first private hours of a royal marriage settling over the apartments at St. James's Palace. The fire in the bedchamber is burning down. The candles in the corridor outside have been mostly extinguished. The court has gone to bed. The new princess, at 16, is in the bed she will share with her husband for the next 15 years, and the long story we have come to follow has, in its narrow private way, begun. Let us now spend some time with Frederick, the Prince of Wales, because Frederick is one of the strangest figures in 18th century British history, and the strangeness deserves a careful description. He was, by almost every contemporary account, a peculiar mixture of qualities that did not quite resolve into a single coherent person. He was charming when he wanted to be, and not charming when he did not. He was generous to his friends and unforgiving to his enemies. He was musically gifted, well-read, and personally cultivated in ways that his rather plain father conspicuously was not. He was also at various moments petty, vindictive, theatrical, dishonest about money, and capable of behaviour that the most loyal of his supporters had difficulty defending. The portraits of him that have survived show a long-faced young man with the prominent features of the Hanoverian family, slightly heavy in the eyes, with a mouth that gives the impression, even in formal portraiture, of being on the verge of a simple, ironic smile. He dressed well. He carried himself well. He had the public manner of a man who had been preparing all his adult life to be the central figure in a court, and who had, until his eventual marriage at 28, not been given the position around which his manner could properly organize itself. His mother, Queen Caroline, who had not seen him for the 14 years of his Hanoverian boyhood, formed her opinion of him after his arrival in England in 1728, and never significantly revised it. The opinion was unflattering. She believed her son to be a liar. She believed him to be lazy. She believed him to be incapable of telling the truth even when the truth would have served him better than the lie. She believed, perhaps most damaging of all, that he was incapable of any genuine affection for any other human being, and that the displays of warmth that he produced from time to time were performances rather than expressions of any underlying feeling. The reasons for the Queen's distinct vehemence on this point have been debated by historians, and various explanations have been offered, including the long separation, the natural irritation of a parent meeting a fully formed adult child for the first time, and the limited ordinary frictions of a court politics that placed mother and son on opposite sides of every contested question. The vehemence itself, however, is not in dispute. The Queen's letters and the Queen's recorded conversations speak with a single voice on this matter for the entire period from her son's arrival in England until her death in 1737, and the voice is consistent, harsh, and disinclined to mitigation. George II, whose own dislike of his son was somewhat less analytically expressed than the Queen's, gave the impression of being exhausted by Frederick rather than passionately opposed to him. He found the Prince of Wales tiresome, extravagant, and in the daily encounters of court life, a constant low-level irritation he would have preferred not to manage. In most disputes, he let Queen Caroline handle the matter. Her preferred response was cold contempt, which she had come to feel was the only adequate answer to her son's character. This pattern set the tone of the relationship between the monarch, the Queen, and the Prince of Wales for the entire period before Frederick's marriage, and it was the pattern Augusta had to negotiate from her first day in residence. Augusta managed the negotiation, by all accounts, with considerable skill. She was modest in her manner. She was deferential to the King and Queen. She was watchful never to take her husband's side in any open dispute with his parents, even when the dispute became loud enough that the entire court was aware of it. She kept her opinions, if she had opinions, to herself. She conducted herself, in her early months at court, with the restrained diplomacy of a young woman who had understood very quickly that the safest position in a divided family was the position of someone who refused to be drawn onto either side. The King, who watched her, came to like her. The Queen, who watched her more carefully, came to like her also, although the Queen's liking always carried with it a modest reservation, an undercurrent of suspicion that any wife of her son must, in the long run, be drawn into his orbit, and lose whatever independent good qualities she had brought to the marriage. The reservation on the Queen's part was probably justified. Augusta, in the long run, did become a partisan of her husband's side in his disputes with his parents, although she did so with such restraint and such public discretion that the Queen, who died 18 months after Augusta's marriage, did not live to see the partisanship in any developed form. And the household at Leicester House, where Frederick and Augusta lived for most of their married life, was a plain parallel court of considerable cultural and political activity. Leicester House was a substantial private mansion on the north side of what is now Leicester Square in London, leased by Frederick from the Earl of Leicester and used as his principal London residence. The house had been the residence of the previous Prince of Wales, who had been Frederick's father, George II, during the years before his accession, and the position of Leicester House as the unofficial headquarters of the heir in opposition was, by the time Frederick took it up, a kind of established political tradition. Frederick added to the tradition by making his Leicester House court a more elaborate and more deliberately cultivated version than his father's had been. The house was decorated. The household was staffed with a large number of attendants. The reception rooms were used for evening entertainments, at which the leading opposition politicians, the leading literary figures of that period, and the leading cultivated wits of the city gathered. The dinners were good, the conversation was animated. The whole atmosphere of the place was deliberately constructed to suggest that the future of British political and cultural life lay with the heir rather than with the reigning monarch. This was the household that Augusta presided over in her capacity as its mistress for the 15 years of her marriage. She was an effective hostess. She learned, over the course of her early years at Leicester House, to manage the elaborate entertainments that the household project required. She learned, in her growing English, to make minor conversation with the politicians and writers who came through the house, and to remember, from one visit to the next, the little personal details that distinguished one visitor from another. She built up, over the years, an accumulated personal acquaintance with the governing class that no Hanoverian princess had previously possessed. She was, in this respect, an unusually effective Princess of Wales, and the political project of the Leicester House Court owed, in significant part, to her steady management of the social side of the operation. The old king himself, who had been in the original arrangement of the marriage one of its principal architects, came over the years to develop for his daughter-in-law a kind of grudging affection that he never developed for his own son. The affection was unusual for the king. He was not, in his general manner, a man given to warm feelings about other members of his family. He preferred, in his daily life, the company of his German mistresses and his German advisers, in whose presence he could relax into the brief Hanoverian habits that 30 years of being King of Britain had not fully displaced. He did not, on the whole, have warm feelings about his daughters. He had, as we have already established, deeply hostile feelings about his eldest son, but Augusta was, in his faint private estimation, a different case. She was modest, she was quiet, she did not, in any visible way, attempt to use her position to extract advantages for her own German relatives. She conducted herself, in his court, when she attended it, with a narrow, careful deference that the king found refreshing after the years of dealing with his more difficult son. He saw her at the appropriate court occasions, when his quarrel with his son did not actively prevent her attendance. He spoke to her in those simple public occasions with a kindness that observers noted because it was so unlike his general manner. He gave her, after the Queen's death in 1737, a limited private allowance that was independent of her husband's allowance, and that she could spend without the formal accounting that the rest of her household budget required. The spare allowance, which was modest by the standards of royal finances of that period, was, according to the household's records, used by Augusta principally for charitable purposes and for the restrained private gifts to attendants and dependents that her position required her to make. The king, who knew this, never raised it with her in any direct conversation. He simply, on the modest public occasions when they met, treated her with the sort of plain, measured kindness that suggested he saw, in her conduct of her position, a young woman who had been delivered into a family situation that was not her fault, and who was, in spite of the situation, conducting herself with the sort of dignity that he was prepared to acknowledge. The relationship between them, which was the only warm relationship across the generational divide that the family produced in this period, lasted from her arrival in 1736 until the king's own death in 1760, 24 years later. It was not, in any visible way, a deep relationship. They did not on the whole see each other often. But the minor consistent kindness that the king extended toward her across the long years of his hostility to her husband was one of the little features of the family's emotional life that historians have, in modern times, recognized as a significant contribution to her ability to survive the difficult position she occupied. She had in the king a quiet ally that none of the other members of her household had. The ally never used his position to give her any direct ministerial support, but the ally was, in his brief measured way, present, and the presence was in itself a kind of protection. The governing project itself, however, was the project of Frederick. He was the one who set its direction. He was the one who decided which politicians to encourage and which to discourage. He was the one who provided the financial backing for various opposition newspapers and pamphleteers, and the one who, through the faint allowances and gifts that the household distributed, kept his parliamentary clients loyal. The project was, in its broad outlines, a project of patient waiting. Frederick understood that he could not directly challenge his father's government, since the government had the resources of the state behind it. He understood that his most likely route to power was the route that all heirs in similar positions had taken, which was to wait for his father to die, and to assemble, in the meantime, the network of supporters who would, when his accession came, be ready to take office under him. This was the strategy. The strategy required, above all, patience. Frederick had patience in some respects but not in others. He had the patience to keep up the slow, steady cultivation of his political network year after year, with the narrow dinners and the simple letters, and the limited considered placements of clients in opposition seats. He did not always have the patience to avoid the spare public quarrels with his father that periodically broke out, and that periodically damaged his cause. The most serious of these quarrels, which broke out in 1737, the year after Augusta's arrival, almost ruptured the family beyond repair, and the personal incident that triggered it deserves a description. Augusta was pregnant with her first child. The child was due in the early autumn of 1737. The convention of that period required that a royal birth be witnessed in some form by senior members of the family and the government to ensure that no substitution of infants could be alleged afterwards. The King and Queen had instructed that the birth should take place at Hampton Court, where they were in residence for the summer, and where Frederick and Augusta were also lodging in apartments that the King had assigned them. Frederick decided, when Augusta went into labour on the evening of the 31st of July, that he would not have his child born at Hampton Court under his parents' eyes. He decided instead to remove his wife from the palace and take her to St. James's, where the birth could take place under his own arrangements rather than under his father's. Augusta was in active labour. The decision was, by any reasonable medical standard, a reckless one. Frederick did not, according to those who were present, consult anyone about the wisdom of moving his wife in this condition. He simply ordered the carriage. He ordered Augusta into the carriage. He took her, in the dark, by carriage from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace, a journey of more than 2 hours, with Augusta in active labour throughout. The child, a girl, was born at St. James's a few hours after their arrival, in apartments that had not been prepared for the birth and that had to be hastily organised by the limited group of attendants who had come with them. Mother and child both survived. The child, who was the eldest of the 9 that Augusta would eventually bear, lived to adulthood. The King and Queen, when they learned what their son had done, were beyond fury. The Queen especially regarded the action as an open declaration of war on the family. She gave it as her settled opinion that her son had moved his wife in active labour for no other purpose than to inflict humiliation on her, his mother, and on his father, by removing the birth from their oversight. The King ordered Frederick out of the royal palaces. The Prince of Wales and his wife and their newborn daughter were removed within a few weeks from their apartments and were directed to find their own accommodation. They moved eventually to a leased house at Norfolk House on St. James's Square, and from there, after some time, back to Leicester House, where they remained for most of the rest of Frederick's life. The breach with the family was now, for the first time, complete. The King refused to receive his son. The Queen refused to receive him. The court was instructed that anyone who attended the King's drawing rooms and also attended the Prince's drawing rooms would be considered to have placed themselves in opposition to the King and would be treated accordingly. The whole political life of the country reorganized itself around the breach. Politicians and courtiers who had been managing until the autumn of 1737 to maintain some degree of footing on both sides of the family quarrel now had to choose. Many chose the king, a smaller number chose the prince. The lines hardened. Augusta, in the middle of all of this, conducted herself with the same careful discretion she had shown from the beginning. She was, after all, the woman who had been carried in active labour from Hampton Court to St. James's by the husband whose decision she had no power to reverse. She had not, by any account, asked to be moved. She had not, by any account, complained when she was moved. She had, in her own quiet way, simply endured the journey, given birth at the end of it, recovered, and continued. The Queen, who was never going to forgive her son, did blame Augusta for what had happened, and the Queen's letters of the following months continue to mention her son's behaviour with the same vehemence as before, but they generally exempt Augusta from the worst of the criticism. The Queen recognised that Augusta had been, in this matter, as much a victim of the prince's reckless decisions as the king and queen themselves were. The Queen died in November 1737, 4 months after the night of the carriage journey. She had been, for some time, suffering from a hernia that she had concealed from her physicians and from her husband, and that had finally produced complications that no medical intervention of that period could correct. She died in the long final illness, with her husband sitting beside the bed, with her children other than Frederick around her, and with Frederick himself excluded from the death chamber by her own explicit instruction, communicated to her husband in one of her last clear conversations. The last expression of her settled feeling about her eldest son was that he should not be permitted to come into the room where she was dying, and her husband respected the instruction. Frederick, who had heard that his mother was dying, and who had presented himself at the gate of the palace requesting admission, was turned away. This is one of the restrained, revealing details of the family's local character. Most parents, even in difficult relationships with their children, find some final reconciliation possible at the moment of dying. Queen Caroline did not. She held her judgment of her son to the last, and she preferred to die without seeing him rather than set that judgment aside. By the standards of any reasonable parent-child relationship, the position was extreme. It did not prevent her from being his mother, but it did mean that the relationship ended in the same form it had held since she had first met him as an adult, almost a decade earlier. There had been no meaningful change. There had been no reconciliation. There had been, on her side, only the consistent disapproval that her letters and conversations had been recording for 9 years. Frederick learned of his mother's death on the morning after it occurred. He went, according to his attendants, into a private room and stayed there for some hours. He came out. He did not, in the days that followed, make any public display of grief. He attended, when his role required it, the various ceremonies of mourning. He wore the mourning clothes. He did not, in the modest recorded private conversations of that period, say very much about what his mother's death meant to him. The relationship had been, for so long, what it had been, that the death of one of its parties did not significantly change anything for the other. He continued, after the funeral, to live the same life he had been living before. Frederick's relationship with his own children, however, was the one part of his life that ran on entirely different lines from his relationship with his parents. He was, with his children, the parent he had not had. He played with them. He sang to them. He wrote them plain letters when he was away. He sat in the nursery and listened to the older children practice their music. He taught the eldest boy, George, the minor rules of the family card games that the household played in the evenings. He took the children, when the weather permitted, on the little outings to the country residences, and walked them, in the brief, careful way of an attentive parent, through the gardens and the orchards and the faint streams that the country properties contained. The eldest son, who was 12 when Frederick died, would carry for the rest of his life the narrow handful of vivid memories of these outings, and the memories would, in his own adult life and in his own raising of his own children, become the principal model that he attempted, with varying degrees of success, to reproduce. Frederick, in the boy's memory, had been a warm, laughing, affectionate man with a specific, simple tilt of his head when he was listening, and a private, limited way of touching the children's hair when he was pleased with something they had done, and a distinct way of singing the spare German folk songs that he himself had learned in his Hanoverian boyhood. The boy had not had time, in the 12 years of overlap, to develop the sort of complicated adolescent reaction against that parent that older boys often develop. He had only the restrained, uncomplicated affection of a young child for an attentive parent, and the affection was the version of Frederick that he carried in his memory for the rest of his life. The death cut off, with the abruptness of all sudden deaths, the relationship at the point at which the child was still inside the modest, uncomplicated love. Frederick, in his son's mind, never aged. Frederick, in his son's mind, never disappointed. Frederick, in his son's mind, remained the warm, laughing figure who had walked beside him in the gardens at Kew on the autumn afternoons of the late 1740s. This is one of the plain features of the eldest son's psychology that, in his later life as the king, observers who knew him well sometimes recognized. He had carried, since the age of 12, a personal minor idealized picture of paternal affection that the actual circumstances of his own life as a parent were, in due course, going to disappoint. He would try, with his own 13 surviving children, to reproduce what he remembered of Frederick's manner. He would, in many of the cases, fail. The relationships between him and his sons, especially, would become some of the most painful relationships of his later life. But the failures were, in some respects, the failures of a man trying to live up to a memory rather than the failures of a man indifferent to the work. He was trying. He was always trying. The trying came, in significant part, from the boy of 12 who had walked beside Frederick in the gardens at Kew, and who had, in the little evening collapse of March 1751, lost the man whose memory he had been carrying ever since. The king, in the years after the Queen's death, did not soften his position on his son. If anything, the position hardened. The Queen's death removed, from the family, the only person who had been able to manage the king's responses, and the king without the Queen became somewhat more rigid in his daily management of his own household. He continued to refuse to receive his son. He continued to refuse to receive members of his son's circle. He continued, year after year, to maintain the formal estrangement that the carriage journey of 1737 had produced, and the estrangement was still in place, in essentially unchanged form, 14 years later when Frederick himself died. The marriage in the meantime was producing children. Augusta bore, between 1737 and 1759, children who survived to adulthood, with 2 more who were born and died in infancy. The children were the principal product of the marriage, and they were also, by the brief measure of family domestic life that the household allowed, the principal pleasure of the marriage. Frederick, whatever his other faults, was a genuinely affectionate father. He played with his children. He took an interest in their education. He composed little pieces of music for them to perform. He sat at his table with them in the evenings. The pictures of the family, painted at various stages by various court painters, show a household that was, in its private domestic arrangements, more ordinary and more affectionate than the public political life of its head suggested. The children were brought up in a household that did not particularly resemble the household of Frederick's own boyhood. Frederick had been raised for 14 years as a kind of administrative orphan. He had decided, very early in his own marriage, that his own children would not be raised that way. The eldest son was born on the 4th of June 1738, less than a year after the carriage journey to St. James's. He was named George. He was the future George III. He was a faint, weak, sickly baby who was not, on his birth, expected to live. He was hastily baptized by one of the court chaplains within hours of his birth, with the King and Queen of Sweden standing as godparents in absentia, because the family had not expected to need to organize a proper baptism so quickly, and the narrow emergency baptism was, in the circumstances, the best that could be managed. The baby survived the first night. He survived the first week. He survived the first month, although his survival was, throughout, considered uncertain. He survived the first year. He grew slowly into a quiet, somewhat dreamy, somewhat slow-developing child, with a local attachment to his mother that the early years of his sickliness had cemented. He would remain, for the rest of his life, the sort of son who depended on his mother in ways that other sons did not. The dependence was the simple, specific feature of the relationship that Augusta and her eldest son developed over the 18 years before her widowhood, and it would, in due course, become one of the principal features of the long second life that the widowhood produced. Other children followed. Edward arrived in 1739, Elizabeth in 1741, William in 1743, Henry in 1745, Louisa in 1749, and Frederick in 1750, the youngest, who would die at 9. The eldest, Augusta, had been born during the carriage journey night of 1737, and Caroline Matilda arrived after her father's death in 1751. The household, by the late 1751-40s, contained a constantly expanding nursery, with the older children moving into more advanced studies and the younger children still in the care of nurses, and Augusta, the mother, presiding over the whole arrangement with the steady managerial competence that she had developed over her years in the household. The education of the children was, by the standards of royal households of that period, unusually careful. Frederick had strong views about instruction, especially the training that should be given to a future king. The eldest son, George, received the principal attention. At various stages of his growing up, tutors were charged with giving him the knowledge an 18th century prince was supposed to possess: Latin and Greek, French and German, mathematics and natural philosophy, music and riding. By the time he reached his teens, his formal accomplishments were respectable, even if no one mistook him for a brilliant scholar. The principal tutors of the boy's education, beyond the day-to-day governor who supervised his limited daily life, were a spare succession of distinguished men whose names recur in the educational records of that period. Francis Ayscough, who was Frederick's chaplain in the years before the prince's death, served as the boy's first principal preceptor and gave the early grounding in Latin and Christian doctrine that the boy's age required. Thomas Hayter, who was a clergyman of considerable scholarly reputation, took over as the principal preceptor when the boy was older and supervised, for some years, the more advanced classical and historical studies. Andrew Stone, who had been one of Frederick's secretaries in the late years, and who had remained close to the household after the prince's death, supervised the ministerial side of the boy's education and introduced him, in a restrained, careful way, to the sort of practical governing knowledge that an heir to the throne was supposed to be acquiring. The Earl of Harcourt, who was the boy's official governor for some years, supervised the broader management of the household and the modest daily decisions that the boy's day-to-day life required. There was, around all of these tutors, the plain ongoing parliamentary controversy about whether the education was being conducted on the right principles, with various rival politicians making their minor representations to Augusta about the kinds of additional tutors they thought should be brought in, or the kinds of changes they thought should be made to the existing arrangements. Augusta, in the little composed way that had always characterized her management of her domestic affairs, listened to the representations and made, in due course, the brief adjustments that her own judgment told her were necessary. She did not, on the whole, allow the political pressures to dictate the principal decisions. She kept the tutors she had when she trusted them and replaced them in the faint, unhurried way of household administration when she did not. The arrangement was, by the narrow surviving evidence of the boy's actual academic progress, mostly successful in the technical sense. The boy learned what he was supposed to learn. The boy acquired the languages. The boy acquired the simple public competence that his position would require. What the boy did not acquire, and what no program of formal tutoring could have given him, was the limited accumulated practical wisdom about politics and people that an active life in his grandfather's court would have provided. The shelter that Augusta had constructed protected him from the spare daily exposures that would have produced this wisdom. The protection was, in the restrained daily logic of his upbringing, a kindness. The cost of the kindness was the absence of the wisdom. The two could not, in the practical terms of his actual life, be both achieved at once. He was not, however, an outstandingly intelligent youth by the standards of his tutors. He was steady. He was hard-working. He was, according to those who taught him, a pupil who had to work harder than his brothers to acquire the same level of knowledge, and who, having worked harder, did not necessarily retain what he had acquired with the easy fluency of a more naturally gifted student. He was the eldest son. He was the heir. The slowness of his development was not, in any sense, an embarrassment to the family. He was simply the student he was, and his tutors made the appropriate accommodations to bring him along at his own pace. By his late teens, the work had produced a prince of solid if unspectacular accomplishments, who could converse capably in 3 or 4 languages, who knew his history reasonably well, and who had, on the surface, the public competence that an heir to the throne was expected to have. Beneath the surface, however, there were modest features that those around him noticed but rarely commented on. He was, in his emotional life, more anxious than his brothers and sisters. He was prone to plain periods of low mood. He was, in his attachments, intense and sometimes obsessive in ways that a more conventional young man of his rank would not have been. He was deeply, almost desperately, attached to his mother. He found, in the steady managerial calm of Augusta's presence, the sort of reassurance that his own internal life did not always provide him. He looked to her, in the minor daily decisions of his developing adolescence, for the sort of guidance that other young men of his age would have sought from their tutors or their friends. The dependence was not in itself unusual for a son of that period. The intensity of the dependence was, and the intensity of the dependence was, when his father unexpectedly died in 1751, and the boy of 12 suddenly became the heir presumptive to the British throne, going to become the most consequential single feature of the boy's emotional life, and one of the most consequential features of the political life of the country for the next 20 years. The death of Frederick, Prince of Wales, in March 1751, came as a surprise to everyone, including the prince himself. He was 44 years old. He had been, for the previous 23 years of his life in England, in generally good health, with the little periodic complaints that a man of his time and his habits might be expected to have, but with no underlying condition that anyone close to him had identified as serious. The illness that killed him was, in its progression, brief. He had taken a chill earlier in the month, after standing too long in cold, damp clothing in the gardens at Kew, where he had been overseeing the laying out of new plantings that he and Augusta had been working on together. The chill had developed, over the following 10 days, into a pulmonary complaint that the physicians of that period attempted to treat with the methods then available. The methods then available included bleeding, blistering, and various preparations of opium and antimony, none of which, by modern medical understanding, would have been likely to help, and several of which would have been likely to hurt. He worsened. He recovered slightly. He worsened again. On the evening of the 20th of March, sitting up in his bed at Leicester House, with Augusta in attendance and various physicians and household officers in the next room, he suddenly raised his hand to his chest, gave a brief cry, and slumped forward. He was dead by the time the physicians reached the bed within a minute. The cause of death, as best the post-mortem of that period could establish, was an internal rupture of some kind, an aneurysm, a complication of the pulmonary illness, or something else that the medicine of 1751 was not equipped to identify. The popular story that subsequently attached to the death, in which the rupture was traced to a blow he had received from a cricket ball some years earlier, has been disputed by historians, and is, in any case, not easy to reconcile with the medical reality of the long interval between the supposed blow and the death. The death was in its essential character sudden and unexpected, and its precise medical cause remained after the post-mortem somewhat speculative. Augusta was 31 years old. She was, at the moment of her husband's death, pregnant with their last child, who would be born 3.5 months later and would be named, after her mother, Caroline Matilda. She had 8 children already, the eldest of whom was 13 and the youngest of whom was 9 months old. She had, in the space of the few minutes of her husband's collapse, been transformed from the mistress of an active ministerial household, with all the social and governing activity that the household conducted, into a widow with a substantial nursery, no parliamentary position, no allies at the king's court, and no obvious resources for managing the years of guardianship that lay in front of her. She did not, according to those who were with her, give way to any extended public display of grief. She organised, with the faint composed competence that had always characterised her, the immediate practical business of the death. She gave instructions about the body. She gave instructions about the household. She wrote, with her own hand, the short formal letter to the king informing him of his son's death. She received, in due course, the messengers that the king sent in return. The king's response to his son's death was, according to those who saw him receive the news, oddly muted. He did not display grief. He did not display by any external sign satisfaction either, although there were observers who suspected that the underlying feeling beneath the formal expressions of regret was closer to relief than to sorrow. He had been estranged from his son for 14 years. He had in that time refused all requests for reconciliation, refused to receive his son at court, refused to permit his son's children to be brought to him for the narrow visits that grandfathers normally make to grandchildren. The death of the son, although it produced complicated political consequences that the king had now to manage, did not, in the king's private feeling, appear to produce the sort of paternal grief that the death of a son might have been expected to produce in a different family. The king, in his recorded reactions, was principally concerned with the practical question of what would now happen to the succession. The new heir presumptive was the eldest of the dead prince's sons, the boy George, who was 12. The king would now, in the unhappy fact of his son's death, have to take some interest in the upbringing of his grandson, who would, in the event of the king's own death before the boy's majority, become king at 21. A simple anonymous epigram circulated at court in the days after Frederick's death. It read, in its rough English version, that here lies Fred who was alive and is dead, and that, since it was only Fred, there was no more to be said. The verses ran on through several stanzas, each one mocking the dead prince's relations with his various family members, and concluding with the limited heartless judgment that since it was only Fred, the matter was not, on the whole, particularly serious. The epigram, in its anonymous circulation, was generally understood to reflect the actual feeling of the king's circle about the death, and the fact that it was anonymous and was therefore deniable did not prevent the people who had liked the dead prince from drawing the obvious conclusions about who, in the king's circle, had composed it. Augusta, who heard the epigram in due course, did not respond to it publicly. She did not, by any account, mention it to anyone in her own circle. She simply, in her spare, composed way, set it aside, in the same place where she had been setting aside, for the previous 15 years, the various other restrained unpleasantnesses of being married to a man whose own family considered him a kind of moving stain on their dignity. The funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on the 13th of April 1751. The king did not attend. The queen, who was dead, did not attend. None of the king's other children attended. The funeral was by these absences an unusually muted royal funeral with the dead prince's wife, who, as a woman, could not, in any case, have walked in the public procession, watching from the modest private gallery that had been arranged for her, and the dead prince's eldest son, who was 12, walking as the principal mourner in the procession through the abbey. The boy was, according to those who saw him that day, in a state of considerable internal disturbance, which he was, with the plain early discipline of a boy who knew that he was now in some unspecified way the centre of public attention, attempting to manage with as much composure as he could find. He walked, he stood at the appropriate moments, he bowed at the appropriate moments. He returned, when the ceremony was over, to the modest group of his family who were waiting in a private room, where he sat down beside his mother and put his head on her shoulder and wept, according to one of the attendants who was present, for nearly an hour without stopping. This is the moment, perhaps more than any other, in which the relationship between Augusta and her eldest son acquired the personal shape it would have for the rest of her life. The boy's father was dead. The boy was now, at 12, the principal heir to the throne, with all the public expectation that the position carried. He was a boy of unusual emotional intensity, and the emotional intensity, on the day of his father's funeral, found its principal outlet in the physical proximity of his mother. She was, in his understanding of his own life, the only person who could provide the sort of stability his internal life required. She was, in fact, the only adult who, for the next several years, would consistently be in a position to provide it. The bond between them, which had been close before the funeral, became, in the months and years after it, the central emotional bond of both of their lives. Augusta, for her part, had not asked for this. She had, in the minor composed way of her own management of her own emotional life, expected the long marriage to her difficult husband to produce a kind of slow, steady widowhood, somewhere in her 60s, after the children were all placed in the world and the household had wound down to the sort of little late residence that elderly royal women lived in. She had not expected to be widowed at 31 with 9 children and a 10th on the way. She had not expected to find herself, in her early 30s, the principal emotional and political figure in the upbringing of a future king. She had not expected to be required, in the absence of any other figure who could fill the role, to construct, more or less from scratch, and on her own, the sort of careful, sheltered education that she came to believe her sensitive eldest son required. But this is what was now in front of her. She accepted it. She organized herself in the months after her husband's funeral to do the work that her new position required. She took up residence at Leicester House with her children. She organized, in close consultation with the king's ministers, the arrangements for the boy's continued education and his eventual transition to the public role he would have to play. She received, in her widowed capacity, the various ministerial figures who came to her with their brief requests and their faint advice. She kept, in her own quiet way, her own counsel, and in the years that followed, she developed, by the slow patient work of her own observation, a clearer governing mind than any of the people around her first appreciated. The education of the new heir presumptive, in the years after his father's death, became one of the great quiet preoccupations of British parliamentary life. The king, who was now in his late 60s, and who had no other interest in the boy beyond what the boy's eventual inheritance of the throne required, was content to leave the education in the hands of others. The others were, in the first instance, the boy's mother. Augusta selected the tutors. Augusta supervised the curriculum. Augusta decided who could and could not visit her son. Augusta, in the narrow daily decisions about how the boy's days were structured, exercised the sort of complete control that the unusual circumstances of his guardianship gave her. The educational arrangements that resulted from this control were, by the standards of royal upbringings of that period, unusually sheltered. The boy was kept, on the whole, away from the king's court. He was kept away from the political life of the capital. He was kept away from the various simple temptations that the City of London in the 1750s offered to wealthy young men of his age. He was kept, instead, mostly at Leicester House and at the family's country residences, in the close company of his tutors, his mother, his younger siblings, and a limited handful of trusted household officers. He was permitted occasional formal appearances at his grandfather's court on the major royal occasions when his attendance was required, and he attended these appearances with the mixture of nervousness and dutiful composure that his upbringing had produced. He was not permitted, on the whole, the spare, unsupervised excursions into the world that other young men of his age and class would have been making. He was, in modern terms, an extremely sheltered young man, and he was sheltered, in significant part, on the deliberate principle that his mother had developed about the sort of upbringing that she believed her eldest son's sharp character required. The principle had its critics. There were observers, in the political class of the 1750s, who watched the upbringing of the heir and worried, in their letters and their conversations, that the boy was being prepared in too sheltered a manner for the very public role he would in due course have to play. He needed, these observers thought, more exposure to the restrained ordinary realities of the world in which he was eventually going to be operating. He needed to meet more people. He needed to encounter, in his daily life, the modest varieties of human character and human situation that a king of an active commercial empire would have to deal with. He was being raised, instead, almost as a kind of private gentleman of unusual learning and unusual piety, with the tutors providing him almost his only window onto the wider world. The result, these critics worried, would be a young man of considerable personal virtue, but of limited practical political experience. And the practical political experience was, in their judgment, the more important of the two qualities for the work he would eventually have to do. Augusta, when she heard these criticisms, did not significantly modify her arrangements. She believed, by the steady observation of her son's character, that her years as his mother had given her, that her son was the sort of person who needed the shelter she was providing, and that the shelter was protecting him from the kinds of temptations and pressures that his local nervous constitution would not have managed well. She had a different understanding of her son than the political observers did. She had, in some respects, a more accurate understanding. She had, in other respects, an understanding shaped by her own deep emotional investment in the boy, and the deep emotional investment was, by the unkinder critics of her arrangements, suspected of being the principal factor in her decisions, rather than any clear-eyed assessment of her son's needs. The truth, as truth in such situations tends to be, was probably mixed. She was right that her son needed shelter. She was probably wrong that her son needed quite as much shelter as she was providing. The household at Leicester House, in the years of the boy's upbringing, settled into a specific daily rhythm that the historians of the family have, in modern times, partially reconstructed from the surviving accounts and household records. The boy rose at 6 in the morning, by his mother's standing instruction, regardless of the season. He was washed, dressed, and brought down to the plain breakfast room on the ground floor, where his mother and his older sisters were already at the table. The breakfast was light by the conventions of that period: bread, butter, a modest portion of cold meat, a glass of milk for the boy, and a cup of weak tea for the mother. The conversation was conducted on alternating days, in English and in French, on the principle that the boy and his sisters needed to maintain the working competence in both languages that their futures would require. After breakfast, the boy was conducted to the minor schoolroom on the first floor, where the principal tutor was waiting. The morning's work, which lasted from 7 until 11, was the formal academic instruction in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and the various other subjects that the tutors had been engaged to teach. At 11, the boy was permitted a little interval of physical exercise, which usually took the form of a walk in the gardens behind Leicester House, in the company of his governor and one of his younger brothers. At noon, the family assembled for the principal meal of the day, which by the standards of royal households was a relatively modest affair, with perhaps 4 or 5 courses, served in the brief private dining room on the ground floor. The afternoon was given over to the smaller cultural studies, music and drawing, and the reading of modern history, conducted by tutors of a less rigorously academic kind than the morning ones. At 4, the boy and his siblings had a faint period of free time, during which they were permitted to play in the gardens or in the narrow playroom that had been arranged for them on the second floor. At 5, the family took tea together, in the manner that was just then becoming customary in fashionable English households. At 6, the boy returned with his governor to the simple evening tasks that the tutors had set for him, which usually consisted of reading and the preparation of the next day's lessons. At 7, supper was served, again in the limited private dining room. At 8, the boy was permitted a spare final hour with his mother in the drawing room, where she would sit with her embroidery, and he would sit beside her with whatever book he was currently reading, and the restrained, quiet end of the day would proceed in the easy, familiar silence of 2 people who had spent their entire lives in close domestic proximity. At 9, the boy went to bed. The pattern, with modest seasonal variations, ran for 10 years. The result, after some years, was a young man of 17 or 18 who was in his learning and his piety and his personal manners an unusually good example of what the sheltered upbringing could produce, and who was, in his practical experience of the world, an unusually limited example of what an heir to a major throne ought, by his age, to have accumulated. He was, in some respects, ready to be king. He was, in other respects, not ready in the ways that mattered most for the work he would in due course have to do. It was during this period, in the early 1750s, that the figure who would dominate the next decade of the family's political life began to enter the household in a serious way. His name was John Stuart, the third Earl of Bute. He was a Scottish nobleman of considerable cultivation, of moderate political views, and of a manner that the people who liked him described as gracious, and that the people who did not like him described as smooth. He had married in 1736 the daughter of a wealthy English heiress, and the marriage had given him the financial resources that allowed him to live on the scale that his ambitions required. He had been introduced to Frederick, Prince of Wales, in the late 1740s, when he had become a member of the prince's plain inner circle at Leicester House. He was a fluent conversationalist. He played the violin and the flute. He had a private interest in botany, which he shared with the prince, and the two had, in the months before the prince's death, been working together on the laying out of new plantings at Kew. He was, in 1751, one of the figures from her late husband's circle whom Augusta knew best, and one of the figures whom she trusted most. After Frederick's death, Bute remained close to the household. He continued to call. He continued to advise. He continued, in his distinct manner of patient attentiveness, to be present at the minor decisions that the new arrangements at Leicester House required. He took, in the months after the funeral, an increasing role in the boy George's education. He was not technically a tutor. He held no formal position in the household, but he was, by the easy access that his standing as a friend of the family gave him, in a position to spend more time with the boy than most of the official tutors did, and the time he spent with the boy began, over the course of several years, to produce in the boy the sort of admiring attachment that intelligent 15-year-olds sometimes form for older men whom they consider to embody all the qualities they themselves wish to acquire. The relationship between Bute and Augusta, in the same period, became also a close one. They were thrown together by the circumstances of the household in a kind of working partnership that the management of the boy's education required. They consulted on the boy's progress. They consulted on the political challenges that the household faced. They consulted on the little daily questions of the running of the establishment. Bute was downtal out in the household in many of the brief functional roles that a husband would have occupied if Augusta had still had a husband. He attended the dinners, he read the letters, he gave advice on the faint placements of clients in the patronage that a princess in her position still controlled. He was, in some respects, the principal figure in her widowed life. The closeness was noticed and discussed. In due course it produced gossip about the nature of the relationship, as a young widow and an older married man in close working partnership were almost bound to produce in 18th century London. The story was that they were lovers, and that their work together concealed an affair the conventions of the period required them to keep hidden. Bute's opponents, along with printmakers and pamphleteers, spread the charge energetically because it offered exactly the kind of entertaining material that could be sold in significant volumes. The truth of the rumour has been debated by historians for the entire 2.5 centuries since it was first set into circulation. The honest position, looking back at the evidence that has survived, is that no one knows for certain. The relationship between Augusta and Bute may have been a working friendship that the conventions of that period made it impossible to conduct without inviting the narrow, dirty inferences of the gossip. The relationship may, alternatively, have been the sort of romantic attachment that the gossip suggested it was, conducted with such discretion that no documentary evidence of it has ever surfaced. The historical record is, on this point, simply silent. What the record does establish is that the partnership, whatever its private nature, was real, that it was central to the running of Augusta's household for nearly 2 decades, and that it had, on the political life of the country, considerably more important than the private question of whether the two parties to it were in any personal sense in love. The most important of these consequences was the influence that Bute came, through his closeness to Augusta and through her closeness to her son, to exercise over the future king. Bute became, in effect, the boy's principal mentor. He talked to the boy about politics. He talked to the boy about religion. He talked to the boy about the sort of king he believed the boy should become. He provided the boy with reading lists. He recommended books. He set out, in his own cultivated way, a kind of program of intellectual and moral formation that the boy, in his admiring attachment, accepted without significant question. The program had, at its centre, a sharp vision of what a British king should be. The vision, which Bute had inherited from a strand of conservative political thought that had been developing since the time of Bolingbroke, was that the king should be a patriot king, who stood above the simple corrupt manoeuvres of the political parties of his own time, who governed for the broad interest of the whole nation, rather than for the narrow interest of the politicians who happened to dominate the Parliament at any given moment, and who, by the steady exercise of his independent judgment, restored to the British Constitution the local dignity and clarity of purpose that the long Whig dominance of the previous generation had, in this analysis, eroded. This was the vision Bute communicated to George. The prince, in his admiring attachment, absorbed it. He absorbed it deeply. He absorbed it as the principal programme of his coming reign. When his grandfather, the old King George II, finally died in October 1760, and George, at 22, suddenly became king, the political programme he carried into his reign was, in significant part, the programme that Bute had set out for him over the previous decade. The programme would, over the next 20 years, produce a series of political crises that would shake the British state to its foundations, contribute substantially to the loss of the American colonies, and earn for the new king a reputation, in his own time and in the histories that followed, that more careful management of his early years might have spared him. This is the consequence that Augusta, in her sheltered upbringing of her son, did not foresee. She had wanted to protect her boy. She had wanted, in the specific emotional logic of her widowhood, to preserve him from the kinds of pressures that she believed his nervous nature could not bear. She had succeeded, in some measure, in protecting him, but the protection had its costs. The boy who, at 22, became king had been protected from the limited ordinary friction of political life that would have given him, by his accession, the practical experience he needed for the work in front of him. He had also been delivered, in his admiring attachment to Bute, into a political programme that the actual circumstances of his reign would not, in the event, support. The two failures were related. Both of them flowed from the same underlying decision, which was the decision to keep the boy, through his most formative years, inside the spare, careful household that his mother had built around him after his father's death. The household had been a kindness. The household had also, in its protective intensity, been a limitation, and the limitations were now, with the accession of the new king, going to begin producing their long consequences in the public life of the country. George II died on the morning of the 25th of October 1760. He was 76 years old. He had been on the throne for 33 years. He had outlived his queen by 23 years, his eldest son by 9, and most of the generation of British politicians who had begun their careers under him. He died in his closet at Kensington Palace, where he had gone, by his usual morning custom, to take chocolate, and where his German valet, hearing him fall, found him on the floor in the restrained private room. The cause of death, as the physicians established later in the day, was a rupture of the right ventricle of the heart, He had been, in the days before his death, in his ordinary state of health for a man of his age, with no warning of any acute condition. The death was sudden. The death was in its private timing, surprising even to those who had been expecting, for some years, the news that the old king had finally gone. The news travelled by the modest efficient communications of the 18th century to the various places where it needed to travel. It travelled very early in the morning to St. James's Palace, where the senior officers of the household were informed. It travelled to the Treasury, where the lords there present convened a plain emergency meeting to consider the immediate practical questions of the succession. It travelled by a special messenger to Carlton House, where the dead king's grandson, the young Prince George, was at that moment having his morning ride in the minor grounds attached to the house, accompanied by his groom and one of his younger brothers. He had just dismounted, according to those who saw him receive the news. He was in his riding clothes. The messenger, who was the senior page of the dead king's bedchamber, knelt before him on the gravel of the little courtyard at the back of the house, and addressed him as "Your Majesty," and informed him that his grandfather had died at Kensington Palace some hours earlier, and that he was now king. The young man, according to the same witnesses, did not display in the moments after receiving the news any visible reaction at all. He did not speak. He did not move. He stood, with his riding gloves in his hand, looking at the kneeling messenger, for what one of the witnesses described as the longest minute of his life. He then, after the long minute, lowered his head briefly, as if collecting himself, and lifted it again, and said, in a voice that was steadier than the witnesses had expected it to be, that he would go inside. He went inside. He went to the room where his mother was at her morning's correspondence. He told her, in a low voice, that the king was dead. She stood up. She crossed the room to him. She took both his hands. She said something, in a voice that the witnesses who were present did not hear distinctly. He nodded. They stood for a moment in silence. She then sat down with him on the brief sofa near the fireplace, and they began, in the faint composed way that they had managed all the difficult moments of his upbringing together, the work of organising the next several hours. The proclamation of the new king took place at St. James's Palace later that day. The new king was 22 years old. He was the first British monarch since Queen Anne to have been born in Britain. He was, by all the accounts that survive of his accession, met by the political class of the country with a kind of relieved interest. The old king, although competent in his administration of the throne, had been, in his last years, a somewhat tired and irritable figure, whose German preferences had not endeared him to the British public, and whose long reign had begun to feel, by the end of it, like a kind of accumulated weight that the country was happy to set down. The new king was young. The new king was British-born. The new king was, by the general report, modest in his manner, and pious in his religion, and hard-working in his habits. The general report, which was largely correct, was a report that the country was prepared to receive with goodwill. The first months of the new reign were, accordingly, mostly successful. The new king made the appropriate court appearances. He addressed his first parliament with an opening speech that he had memorized carefully and delivered with the sort of solid popular competence that his upbringing had produced. He received the foreign ambassadors. He attended, with the new dutifulness that his religious convictions required, the open services at the chapels royal. He visited, as the social calendar required, the various great country houses of the senior nobility, where he was received with the sort of attention that the new king was always going to receive. The accession was going well. The new reign, in its earliest months, was running smoothly. The principal political question of the early reign was, however, already developing in the narrow private rooms of the king's household, where the king's relationship with the Earl of Bute was, by the natural extension of the relationship as it had developed during the years of preparation, beginning to acquire the sort of public political form that would shortly make it the principal preoccupation of every working politician in the country. Bute, who held no formal office at the moment of the accession, was given, in the first weeks, a series of court positions that gave him the right of constant access to the new king. Within a year of the accession, Bute had been appointed Secretary of State for the Northern Department, which made him a senior minister of the Crown. Within 2 years of the accession, Bute had been appointed First Lord of the Treasury, which made him, in the conventions of that period, the principal minister of the government, in what we would now call the position of Prime Minister. The advancement was, by the standards of that period, extraordinarily rapid. Bute had no parliamentary base of his own. He was a Scottish peer, which made him, to the English parliamentary class, a foreigner of a particularly unwelcome variety. He had no real experience of the sort of practical management that the position required. He was, in the eyes of the governing world, in his position entirely because of his personal influence with the new king, and the personal influence was, in turn, understood to derive partly from his earlier influence with the king's mother, in whose household he had been the principal figure for the previous decade. The result was the emergence, in the public ministerial life of the early 1760s, of a distinct kind of governing opposition that combined in its various publications and pamphlets and prints several distinct strands of complaint into a single sustained criticism. The charge was on Bute, the campaign was on Augusta, the assault was, by extension, on the new king himself, although the abuse on the king was always conducted with the simple formal deference that the parliamentary class still observed toward the person of the monarch. The opposition press of the early reign produced, in its accumulated material, one of the most aggressive campaigns of personal criticism on members of the royal family that the British public had ever seen. The campaign had several principal lines of criticism. The first was the line about Bute and Augusta as lovers. The campaign asserted, in print and in caricature, that the relationship between the Dowager Princess of Wales and her late husband's friend was a sexual relationship conducted under the cover of the political partnership, and that Bute's influence over the king derived, in the most simple sense, from his influence over the king's mother. The caricatures, which appeared in considerable numbers in the early 1760s, took various forms, all of them coarse, several of them so coarse that the modern historian, looking through the surviving examples in the print collections of the British Museum, has difficulty believing that the British public of the 1760s was prepared to consume material of that character about a member of the royal family. The second line of attack was the line about Augusta as the secret political ruler of the country. This line asserted that the new king was, in some real sense, dominated by his mother in the same way that he had been dominated as a boy, that the public face of his government was a kind of theatrical screen behind which his mother and her favourite were conducting the business of the state, and that the king himself was, in the words of one personal pamphlet, a doll moved by the strings that his mother held. This line was, in its most extreme version, a substantial overstatement of the political situation. The king, by all the evidence of the surviving correspondence, was making his own decisions, although he was making them with heavy reliance on Bute's advice. Augusta's role in the operation of the government was peripheral rather than central. But the perception that she was central was, in the heated political atmosphere of that period, very widely held, and the perception, in politics, often matters more than the underlying reality. The third line of attack was the line about Augusta's German origins, her foreignness, her supposed continuing attachment to the limited German principalities that she had come from. This line drew on a long-running anti-Hanoverian thread in British public opinion that had been, in the previous reigns, used against her father-in-law and her grandfather-in-law, and was now being used against her with the additional charge that she was, beyond being merely Hanoverian, somehow not even properly Hanoverian, but rather the daughter of a spare minor German court of no real consequence to anyone, who had been raised to a position in the British state that her origins did not justify. This line was, in its essence, the sort of low xenophobic complaint that British public discourse has produced periodically against various foreign-born members of the royal family across the centuries, and the line was, in its sharp application to Augusta, given additional sharpness by the political circumstances of the early 1760s. The combined effect of the three lines of attack across the publications and prints of that period was to make Augusta, by the middle 1760s, perhaps the most publicly hated member of the royal family that Britain had seen in living memory. She was abused in pamphlets. She was caricatured in prints. She was hissed at by crowds when her carriage was recognised in the streets. She was, on at least one occasion when she had been at a public event and was returning to her residence at Carlton House, the subject of a restrained mob that had gathered along her route and that had thrown rubbish at her carriage as she passed. She did not, according to those who were with her on that day, give any external sign of being affected by the experience. She sat in the back of the carriage with her hands folded and looked straight ahead and waited for the carriage to pass through the modest, ugly demonstration. She arrived at Carlton House composed and apparently uninjured. She did not, in the days that followed, refer to the incident in any conversation that anyone subsequently recorded. She simply, as she had handled all the other plain unpleasantnesses of her long life, set the experience aside and went on with her work. It was during this period in the early 1760s that George's union with Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz took place, and we have to come now to that event, because it brings Augusta into the position of being mother-in-law to a queen. The dynamics that developed between Augusta and Charlotte over the 11 years that followed are, in some respects, the deepest part of the story we have come tonight to follow. The match was arranged, like most royal matches of that period, by careful negotiation among trusted court officials, with George involved at the principal decision points and senior advisers consulted along the way. The principal adviser on his side was, predictably, Bute. The object was to find a Protestant princess of suitable rank, suitable age, acceptable appearance, and minor enough consequence to her own family that a British alliance would not produce awkward foreign entanglements. The list of candidates was not large. Over the early months of 1761 it narrowed to a final group, and from that group the choice fell on Charlotte, the 17-year-old daughter of the late Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a German principality of even smaller consequence than Augusta's Saxe-Gotha. Charlotte was slightly older than Augusta had been at her own marriage. She was also, by the brief reports that came back from the diplomatic missions, rather plainer in her appearance than Augusta had been. The reports of her appearance were, in the candid manner of such reports, unflattering. She was, by the descriptions of the diplomats who had seen her, slight, with the long face and prominent features, and a complexion that was not, by the standards of that period, considered fashionable. She was, however, modest in her manner, well educated for a princess of her rank, devoutly Protestant, and entirely lacking in any of the faint political encumbrances that a princess from a more substantial state might have brought with her. She was, in the language of the negotiations, exactly the kind of suitable bride that the king's circumstances required. The king, when the reports were brought to him, examined the narrow painted miniature that the diplomats had also sent, and considered the question for some hours, and gave, in due course, his approval to the choice. The diplomatic instructions were sent. The proposal was made to the family in Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The family accepted. The arrangements for the bride's journey to England were begun. By the late summer of 1761, Charlotte was on her own ship coming up the Thames, in a manner that consciously echoed Augusta's own arrival 25 years earlier, although on this occasion the bride was being delivered to a king rather than to a Prince of Wales, and the household into which she was being delivered was a household that had, at its quiet centre, a mother-in-law who was about to become one of the principal figures in the young woman's new life. Charlotte arrived in London on the 7th of September 1761. The marriage took place on the same evening, in a ceremony at the Chapel Royal at St. James's, with the king and the bride meeting for the first time only a few hours before the wedding itself. The compression of the timetable was deliberate. The diplomats had reported that the bride was nervous. The advisers had thought it kindest to dispose of the ceremonies with as little intervening time as possible, so that the bride could be settled into her new life without having to endure the protracted formal preparations that a longer interval would have required. She was met at the dock by a simple delegation. She was driven directly to St. James's. She was conducted to apartments where she was dressed for the wedding. She was brought to the chapel where the king was waiting. They were married. They returned to the apartments. The next day they began their married life. The new queen was, by all accounts, considerably more nervous on her arrival than Augusta had been on hers. She did not have the same temperamental composure. She was not, in the early days, in good health, having endured a difficult sea crossing during which she had been seriously seasick. She was, according to those who met her in the first days, somewhat shy and somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening to her. She made, however, a creditable effort at her ceremonial duties. She was polite to the king, who was polite to her in return. She was deferential to the dowager princess, who received her with the limited careful warmth that Augusta knew the moment required. She did, in the spare public way that the conventions of that period required, what she had to do. Augusta's relationship with her new daughter-in-law, in the early months of the marriage, was managed with the same careful diplomacy that Augusta had brought to all her other complicated relationships within the family over the years. She was, on the surface, warm. She was in the restrained public ways that the court watched, attentive and supportive. She received Charlotte at Carlton House with all the modest honours that a dowager princess could offer to a new queen. She made, in her conversations and in her letters, the plain encouraging remarks that a senior woman of the family could make about a junior one. She did not, in any visible way, attempt to assert any kind of dominance over her daughter-in-law's minor private establishment. Beneath the surface, however, the relationship was somewhat more complicated than the public face of it suggested. Augusta had, for a decade, been the principal woman in her son's life. The son had, for a decade, depended on her for the kind of emotional and practical guidance that a sensitive young man required. The son was, for the first time in his adult life, now in a relationship with another woman who was, by the formal arrangements of the marriage, in a position to take some of the emotional space that his mother had previously occupied. Charlotte herself, who was in the position of being the new junior partner in the household's existing emotional arrangements, was a local kind of person whose character deserves a moment of separate description. She was, in her own native temperament, considerably more reserved than Augusta had been at her age. She was, in her interests, narrower. She was intensely religious, in a quiet German Lutheran way that the British court found sometimes excessive. She had a specific interest in music, in which she was a creditable performer on the harpsichord, and a private interest in botany, which she shared with her husband, and which gave her, over the years of her marriage, one of the principal cultural interests of her later life. She was not, by the standards of the British court, a clever woman in any sparkling social sense. She did not produce witty conversation. She did not, on the whole, command the attention of a room when she entered it. She had, instead, a kind of quiet, patient steadiness that her husband, in his own quiet, patient steadiness, came over time to value above the more brilliant qualities that other queens of that period might have brought to the position. The marriage between her and the king was, by the standards of royal marriages of that period, a good marriage. They were, in their daily habits, well suited. They were, in their religious convictions, in close agreement. They were, in their political views, mostly in agreement, although Charlotte was careful never to push her own political opinions in the public way that her mother-in-law had been accused of pushing hers. They were, above all, in their habits of work, very similar. The king was a hard worker. Charlotte was a hard worker. The household they ran together was an establishment that, by the standards of British royal homes of that period, ran on more disciplined and more regular lines than any in the previous generation. The king, in this respect, was reproducing the disciplined order of his own boyhood at Leicester House, and Charlotte, who had been raised in a similarly disciplined little German court, was naturally inclined to support the arrangement. The two of them, in their long marriage of 57 years, would produce a household that became, in due course, one of the most studied royal households in modern British history, with the brief, careful daily routines of the king and queen recorded in considerable detail in the diaries of the various household officers and the various foreign visitors who came to observe them. The household was not, on the whole, a glamorous one. It was, on the whole, a working one. And the working character of it was, in some respects, the principal achievement of the marriage, exactly the kind of slow, steady, regular family life that the king's father had not had with his parents, and that the king himself, by the faint, careful programme of his own private decisions, was determined to provide for his own children. This was, in any family of the period, the kind of moment that produced narrow tensions between mothers and daughters-in-law. In a royal family, where the spaces being contested were also spaces of public political consequence, the simple tensions had the potential to become considerably larger. Augusta managed the limited tensions with her usual restraint. She did not, at any moment, attempt to diminish her daughter-in-law in her son's eyes. She did not, in her conversations with her son, make the spare, unkind remarks about Charlotte that a less disciplined mother-in-law might have made. She did not, in her correspondence with the various members of her own circle, complain about Charlotte in the kinds of terms that Queen Caroline had complained about Frederick. Augusta had grown up in a family that complained about its junior members, and she had married into another family that complained about its junior members, and she had decided, by some restrained, composed decision that she had made many years before, that she was not going to be, in her own household, the kind of senior woman who continued the tradition. Charlotte, for her part, came to Augusta with a careful respect that the early difficulties of her own position required her to maintain. She knew that the dowager princess was the most influential single figure in her husband's life. She knew that any attempt to displace her in the early months of the marriage would be both impossible and counterproductive. She therefore, in her own modest, composed way, accepted the secondary position that the household's existing dynamics had assigned her. She visited Augusta regularly. She consulted Augusta on the plain questions of her own establishment. She received from Augusta the minor advice that her unfamiliarity with her new position made it useful to receive. The visible result was a relationship between the two women that was, by the standards of royal mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law of the period, unusually civil. The two women were not, on the whole, close. They did not, according to those who saw them together, develop the kind of warmth that a more naturally compatible pair might have developed. But they did not, on the whole, openly quarrel. They managed the little daily occasions of their family interaction with the brief, careful courtesy that both of them were in their different ways capable of. The household, which the political opposition outside it was attempting to portray as a den of secret feminine intrigue, was, in its actual private operation, a relatively peaceful establishment, in which the senior and junior women of the family kept out of each other's way, and conducted their respective affairs with an uneasy but functional truce. Beneath the truce, however, there was a distinct fact that the political situation of the period would not allow either woman to forget. The king's relationship with his mother was, even after his marriage, the most emotionally important relationship of his adult life. He continued to call on her almost daily. He continued to consult her on the faint ministerial decisions of his reign. He continued, in the narrow evidence of his surviving correspondence, to address her with the kind of dependent affection that he had developed in childhood, and that his marriage had not significantly displaced. Charlotte, who saw all of this, made her simple adjustments. She did not compete. She did not complain. She built instead, with the patience that her own personal character produced, the kind of long marriage that did not require her to be the principal woman in her husband's life. She was the mother of his children. She was the queen of his court. She was the consort of his public ceremonies. She was not, on the whole, the principal confidant of his inner mind. The principal confidant of that inner life, for as long as that confidant lived, was his mother, and Charlotte, in the limited household decisions of her own life, accepted the arrangement that she had no power to change and concentrated instead on the parts of her position that she did have power to manage. The result, over the 11 years that the two women would coexist as the senior women of the royal family, was a sharp kind of stable, distant peace. They did not, in the public record or in the private letters, ever say anything memorable about each other. They did not, in any sustained way, become friends. They did not, in any visible way, become enemies. They simply, in the manner of many mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationships throughout history, occupied their respective positions, performed their respective duties, and waited, by the spare inevitable progression of time, for the situation to resolve itself one way or another. The situation did, in the end, resolve itself. It resolved itself in the way that such situations almost always do, which is by the death of one of the two parties involved. Augusta, who was the older, was the one who died. The death came when it came, in the early months of 1772, after a long final illness whose nature she had concealed, in the manner of her late mother-in-law Queen Caroline, from those around her, until concealment was no longer possible. Boat's tenure as the King's First Lord of the Treasury was, by the standards of British ministerial careers of the period, brief. He held the position for less than a year. The combination of his lack of parliamentary base, his Scottish origin, the public hostility to his supposed personal influence over the king, and his own temperamental unsuitability for the rough business of practical governing management, produced a situation in which the government was, almost from its formation, under sustained attack from every quarter of the parliamentary world. Bute himself, according to those who saw him in the period, was deeply unsettled by the experience. He was a man of cultivated tastes who had not expected, when he had accepted the various advancements that the king's favour had given him, to find himself the principal target of the most aggressive political abuse the country had produced in a generation. He was attacked in pamphlets. He was attacked in newspapers. He was attacked in caricatures. He was attacked on at least one occasion when he had been at a public event and had been recognised in the street. by a crowd that had thrown stones at his sedan chair and had broken the glass and forced him to take refuge in a nearby house until the restrained mob had dispersed. Within a year of his appointment, he had concluded that he could not continue in the position. He resigned in April 1763 after the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War, on which his ministry had staked much of its prestige, and which was, in the event, deeply unpopular with the parts of the ministerial class that had wanted harder terms imposed on France. He retired, in his resignation, from active governing life, and he never held another high office under the king. He continued, for some years afterwards, to be present at court, and to be, in a modest private way, consulted by the king on various matters. But the principal phase of his parliamentary career was over. He spent his later years on his Scottish estates, and at his English country house at Luton, where he developed his serious botanical interests in the careful, unhurried way that his temperament had always preferred, and that the plain dignity of a retired nobleman of his rank could now support. Augusta, after Bute's resignation, continued to live the life she had been living. She was, in her own person, less prominent than the abuse of the period suggested. After 1763, she had no significant influence on her son's government beyond the minor council any mother of a sitting monarch might have. George III was now governing with senior politicians whose careers had been made in the parliamentary world rather than in the court, and whose advice he was, by constitutional convention, required to take more seriously than hers. He continued to visit her and to consult her on little private questions of family life. But in the principal ministerial decisions of his reign, he was now, more than in the first years, his own minister. The public abuse of Augusta did not, however, decline with the decline of her real importance. The print culture of the period, which had built up Augusta as the secret power behind the throne, was not in any hurry to dismantle the figure it had created, even after the figure no longer corresponded to the underlying reality. The pamphlets continued. The caricatures continued. The hostile portrayal of the Dowager Princess and her supposed continuing intrigues with Bute became, over the course of the 1760s, one of the established themes of opposition political literature, and it continued to appear, in various forms, for the entire remaining period of Augusta's life. She lived, during this period, principally at Carlton House in London, and at the brief establishment she had built up over the years at Kew, on the south side of the Thames, a few miles upriver from Westminster. Carlton House was the official London residence of the Dowager Princess. It had been, in a previous generation, the residence of various Hanoverian princes, and it had been substantially renovated by Frederick before his death, and further developed by Augusta in her widowhood. It was, in its full form, a substantial classical mansion, with a large garden running down to the Mall, and with extensive accommodation for the household and its visitors. It would later, after Augusta's death and through the early 19th century, become the principal residence of her grandson George IV in his time as Prince Regent, and it would, in that role, become one of the most famous private houses in London. In Augusta's time, before all of that, it was simply the dignified residence of the Dowager Princess, run by her on a more modest scale than her grandson would later run it on, and used by her principally as the working London base from which her formal duties were discharged. The Carlton House establishment, in the years of Augusta's residence, settled into the faint local rhythms that a dignified widowed household of the period would settle into. The house contained, beyond Augusta's own apartments, the apartments of her senior ladies-in-waiting, the apartments of her 2 principal chaplains, the narrow library that she had built up over the years, and that contained perhaps 1,500 volumes in English, French, German, and Italian, and the simple gallery in which the family portraits had been arranged. The household staff numbered at its full complement perhaps 80 persons, of whom the great majority were the limited functional servants of a working great house: kitchen staff, laundry staff, gardeners, grooms, footmen, the porter at the gate, the spare specialized attendants whose specific duties had been preserved from earlier reigns. Above this functional staff was the restrained senior household, which included the gentleman comptroller, who oversaw the financial accounts, the master of the horse, who oversaw the stables, the senior chaplain, who oversaw the religious offices, and the modest handful of senior ladies who oversaw the women's side of the establishment. The household ran by the plain, careful management of these senior officers and by Augusta's own quiet supervision on disciplined and economical lines. There was no extravagance by the standards of royal households of the period. There was no significant entertainment beyond what Augusta's position absolutely required her to host. There was, on the whole, a kind of quiet, measured dignity to the establishment that the various foreign visitors who came through it in the 1760s remarked on, sometimes with surprise when they had been led by the public reputation of the Dowager Princess to expect something different. Kew, however, was the place she preferred. Kew had been, before her marriage, the country residence of various senior figures in the royal household. It had been acquired by Frederick, with Augusta's enthusiasm, in the late 1740s, and the two of them had begun, in the years before his death, the slow, patient work of laying out the grounds in the elaborate manner that the period considered fashionable. Frederick's death in 1751 had interrupted the work. Augusta, in her widowhood, had taken it up again, and had, over the next 20 years, developed Kew into one of the most important botanical gardens in Europe. Leuk is de moest zoekdienst Wolfmo. The work at Kew is, in some respects, the most lasting of Augusta's contributions to British public life, and it deserves a careful description. She did not, on the whole, do the work herself. She was a patron rather than a practitioner, but she selected the practitioners with care, she gave them the resources they required, and she supported them, year after year, with the steady, patient attention that had characterized her management of all her serious projects. The principal practitioner she selected was a man called William Ayton, a Scottish gardener of considerable practical and theoretical knowledge, who had trained at the Chelsea Physic Garden under the great Philip Miller, and who had come to Kew in 1759 at Bute's recommendation. Ayton, with Augusta's support, and with Bute's personal guidance on the gardening side, set about transforming the walled gardens at Kew into a serious working establishment. New plantings were brought in, new hothouses were built. Plants were imported from the various overseas territories of the British Empire, where the minor expeditions of plant collectors that the period was beginning to send out were producing, in their accumulated specimens, the makings of a global plant collection that no previous European garden had been in a position to assemble. By the late 1760s, the gardens at Kew contained more identified species of plants than any other garden in Britain, and probably more than any other garden in Europe, except possibly the Jardin du Roi in Paris. The achievement was, in its quiet way, considerable. The achievement was, in significant part, Augusta's, although her personal involvement in the technical decisions had been limited, and her main contribution had been the steady financial and political support that allowed Ayton and Bute to do their work. There were also, in the gardens, the various architectural features that the period considered indispensable to a serious garden of this kind. There was a little classical temple, known as the Temple of Bologna. There was an orangery, designed by William Chambers, who was the principal architect Augusta employed at Kew over the 1760s. There was a brief ruined arch designed in the antique manner, set among trees, so that it gave the impression of a remnant of some classical past that had survived in the English landscape by accident. And there was, most famously of all, the pagoda, which Chambers built between 1761 and 1762, and which became, in its day, the most discussed piece of garden architecture in Britain. The architect Chambers, whom Augusta employed for the principal architectural projects at Kew through the 1760s, deserves a brief separate mention because his career was so closely bound up with the gardens that the visitor to Kew even today is walking through what is, in significant part, his work. He was a Scotsman of complicated international background. He had been born in Sweden, where his merchant father had settled. He had worked, as a young man, for the Swedish East India Company, in a position that had taken him on 3 voyages to the East, including the long stay in Canton that had given him his private knowledge of Chinese architecture. He had returned to Europe in his late 20s, studied architecture in Paris and Rome, and come to England in the early 1750s, where he had quickly become one of the most fashionable young architects of the period. Augusta, who had hired him in 1757 on the recommendation of Bute, gave him, over the next decade, the kind of free hand at Kew that allowed him to develop the principal practical and theoretical contributions of his career. He designed the orangery. He designed the various simple temples in the antique manner. He designed the pagoda. He published, in 1763, an illustrated volume describing all of his principal works at Kew, with engraved plates of the various structures and detailed descriptions of the design choices he had made. The volume became, in due course, one of the most influential books in the European garden literature of the late 18th century, and Chambers's reputation, which had been built up principally through the work at Kew, became the foundation of the much larger career he had in his later years, when he became the principal architect of the British state and designed, among many other public buildings, Somerset House on the Strand. The whole of this later career was made possible, in significant part, by the patronage that Augusta had given him at Kew in the years when he was still a young architect looking for his first major opportunity. She had given him the opportunity. He had repaid the opportunity with the works that, 2.5 centuries later, are still standing in the gardens that bear, in some sense, her name. The relationship between patron and architect was, like the relationship between Augusta and Ayton, an example of the distinct kind of cultural patronage that her style produced. She did not interfere with the technical decisions. She gave the practitioners the resources they needed. She supported them year after year with the steady, patient attention that the long projects required. The result was the limited set of institutions and buildings and gardens that have lasted in the public landscape of Britain longer than the political controversies of her own time, and that constitute, in the long retrospect, the most substantial of her contributions to the country she had come to as a young bride in 1736. But the basic structure stood, and it stands today, in the gardens that Augusta and her gardeners had laid out. And the visitor who walks through Kew Gardens in the present day is walking, in significant measure, through Augusta's garden, with the various plantings and structures that she and her successors created still in their places, and with the original layout that her decisions established still recognizable through the modifications of the centuries, since this is the part of Augusta's legacy that has lasted. The political reputation that the opposition press of her own time built up, and that the historians of the 19th century inherited and largely accepted, was a reputation that careful modern historians have, on examination of the actual evidence, considerably revised. The picture of Augusta as the secret political ruler of the country has been, by the standards of the surviving documentary record, mostly dismantled. The picture of Augusta as the patient builder of one of the great plant institutions of Europe has, by the same standards, been mostly confirmed. The pagoda is still there. The orangery is still there. The basic plan of the gardens is still there. The horticultural collection that Ayton built up under her patronage formed the foundation of what would, after Augusta's death and under the long management of Sir Joseph Banks, become the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which is now, by general agreement of the international garden community, the most important institution of its kind in the world. The institution has its origins, in a real and traceable sense, in the spare projects that Augusta and her late husband began at Kew in the late 1740s, and that Augusta continued after her widowhood, with the steady patient support that her personal style of patronage produced. Augusta's daily life at Kew, in the years when she was in residence, settled into a personal rhythm that the surviving accounts allow us to reconstruct in some detail. She rose, by the standing habit of her adult life, at 6 a.m, regardless of the season. She was attended by her senior dressing woman, who had been with her for over 20 years, and who knew, by long acquaintance, the restrained personal preferences of her morning toilette. She breakfasted in the modest morning room overlooking the eastern parterre, with her senior lady-in-waiting and 1 or 2 of the children of the household when they were in residence with her. After breakfast, she received the senior officers of the household for the plain daily consultations that the running of the establishment required. She read with care the morning's correspondence which arrived by messenger from London and from the various other royal residences. She wrote, in her own hand, the minor letters that her position required her to write. By 11 a.m, she was usually finished with the little administrative business of her day, and the rest of the morning was given over to whatever larger project she was currently working on. In the 1760s, the larger project was, more often than not, some aspect of the work at Kew. She walked, with William Ayton, and with 1 or 2 of the senior gardeners, through the various sections of the gardens, looking at the new plantings and discussing the brief decisions that Ayton wanted her input on. She sat in the faint library that had been arranged for her in the principal residence, looking at the botanical books that the various correspondents of Ayton and Bute kept sending in for her attention. She wrote, in the narrow, careful way of her own personal style, the letters of thanks and acknowledgement that the steady stream of botanical gifts produced. The midday meal was taken, when the weather permitted, in the simple dining loggia overlooking the river, which had been built for that purpose, and which gave a view, on clear days, across the Thames to the limited fields and woods of the North Shore. The meal was simple by the standards of royal dinners, 4 or 5 courses, with the cooking conducted by her own household staff in the spare kitchens behind the principal apartments. The afternoon was given over to whatever further work the day's projects required, with the restrained interval for the rest that the conventions of the period made universal. The evening, in the warmer months, was spent in the gardens with the modest additional walks that the long northern summer twilight permitted. The evening, in the colder months, was spent in the principal drawing-room with the household's plain evening occupations of reading and embroidery, and the occasional minor musical performance. The day ended by her standing habit, with prayers in the little private chapel attached to the apartments, and bed by 10. That daily rhythm, like the boys' upbringing at Leicester House, ran with brief variations for nearly 2 decades. It was the substance of her later life and of the work at Kew, in the faint daily decisions that the historical record only partially preserves, but that, when reconstructed even in this partial way, give the modern observer some sense of what the slow, patient effort actually consisted of. The achievement is real. The achievement is hers. And the achievement is, in some respects, more than enough to balance the various narrow political controversies that her own contemporaries thought were the principal substance of her public career. Augusta also, during her later years, paid attention to the growing collection of grandchildren that her son and daughter-in-law were producing. George and Charlotte, who had begun their marriage in 1761, started their family at the rate that the conventions of the period and the dynastic requirements of the British throne required. Their first child, the future George IV, arrived in August 1762. Frederick followed in 1763 and the future William IV in 1765. By Augusta's death in 1772, the royal couple had 7 children, and they would eventually have 15, of whom 13 would survive to adulthood. The nursery, by the standards of British royal families of any period, was substantial. Augusta's relationship with her grandchildren was, according to those who saw it, warmer than her relationship with her daughter-in-law. She made, in the simple ways that grandmothers of the period made, a steady effort to be present in the children's lives. She received them, in their nursery clothes, on visits to Carlton House and to Kew. She gave them limited presents on the appropriate occasions. She remembered their birthdays. She inquired, in her letters to Charlotte, about their health and their progress. The eldest, George, who would become the Prince Regent, and then George IV, was a sharp favourite. He was a charming, lively, affectionate child, with a warmth of manner that his rather reserved father conspicuously lacked, and the warmth communicated itself to his grandmother in a way that the more dutiful character of his father had not always done. Augusta was, according to those around her, fond of the boy in a local way. She did not live to see the long complications of his adult life, which would in due course become some of the most notorious public scandals of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. She knew him only as the spare, charming boy who came in his nursery clothes to her drawing-room, and the restrained, charming boy was the version of him that she carried in her affection to her grave. The eldest grandson, the future George IV, who had been Augusta's specific favourite, was 9 years old at the time of her death, and was old enough to remember her clearly for the rest of his life. He carried in the modest, private way that the young carry these things, the memory of the elderly grandmother in her dark gowns, who had received him on the plain visits to Carlton House, who had given him gifts, who had spoken to him in her low, careful English with her German accent that he had associated, ever after, with a private kind of quiet affection. The other older grandchildren, the boys Frederick and William, who were 8 and 7 respectively at her death, also retained fragments of memory of her. The younger ones did not. The youngest of the surviving grandchildren by 1772, who was the modest Princess Augusta, named after her grandmother, was 4 months old at the death, and would have, in her later life, only the little pictures and the quiet family stories to construct any sense of the grandmother whose name she carried. The relationship with the king himself, in this period, continued in its accustomed pattern. He visited her almost daily when he was in London. He wrote to her constantly when he was at Windsor, or at the country residences he was beginning to develop in his own taste. He consulted her on the private questions of his life. He sought her approval, in the secluded way that her continued importance to him required, for the various decisions of his life that did not, strictly speaking, require her approval at all. The dependence that had been formed in the years of his sheltered upbringing had not, even after a decade of marriage and the production of 7 children, significantly diminished. Charlotte, who saw all of this, continued in the slight accommodating way she had developed in the early years to manage the situation as best she could. The illness that would kill Augusta began in some form in the late 1760s. The first signs were quiet but persistent. A hoarseness stayed in her throat. Hearing became harder. A recurring discomfort began to trouble her. The signs were, by themselves, not particularly alarming, and Augusta, with her characteristic stoicism, did not bring them to the attention of her physicians. She continued in the way that she had always continued, with whatever the plain daily complaints of her body produced. By 1770, the signs had become harder to ignore. The hoarseness had thickened. The difficulty in swallowing had become a more consistent problem. There was, occasionally, a narrow trace of blood in what she coughed up. Her physicians, when they were finally consulted, examined her in the limited manner that the medicine of 1770 permitted. They could see, by looking down her throat with such instruments as they had, that there was a thickening of the tissues in the back of her mouth that was not, by their experience, normal. They did not, by the limitations of their period, have any reliable means of diagnosis beyond the visual inspection. They did not, by the same limitations, have any reliable treatment to offer for whatever the thickening was. They prescribed, in the standard manner of the period, a series of preparations that were intended in their general way to dissolve obstructions and to restore the tissues to their proper condition. The preparations did not help. The thickening continued. The difficulty in swallowing got worse. The historians and medical historians of subsequent centuries, looking back at the descriptions that survive of Augusta's final illness, have generally concluded that what she was suffering from was a cancer of the throat, in the area at the back of the mouth that the 18th century physicians could see but could not effectively treat. The medical understanding of cancer in 1770 was, by modern standards, almost non-existent. The disease was understood as a kind of growth or thickening of the affected tissues with no clear theory of its origin and no effective treatment. The recommended treatments, which combined the various preparations that the materia medica of the period considered to be dissolving or astringent, did nothing to halt the underlying disease. The physicians who attended Augusta in her last months were, in the technical sense, doing their best, but their best was not, by the limits of their period, sufficient to produce any meaningful improvement. They could only attempt, by the various preparations of opium and other modest pain-relieving substances, to reduce the discomfort of the dying. The dying, in cases of throat cancer in the 18th century, was not on the whole a comfortable process. The progress of the disease produced, in its later stages, increasing difficulty in swallowing, which produced in turn the slow starvation that often accompanied the disease in its terminal months. The patient, in the standard course, gradually lost weight, became weaker, lost the ability to take in solid food, and eventually, in the last weeks, had difficulty even with the little fluid preparations that the household tried to keep her alive on. The death, when it came, was usually a death by the combined effects of starvation, exhaustion, and the various secondary complications that the underlying disease produced. Augusta's death, by the descriptions of those who were present, followed this general pattern. She had, in the last weeks, been visibly wasting. She had, in the last days, been able to take in only the smallest of fluid preparations. She had, in the last hours, been mostly silent and mostly unconscious, with the quiet, slow breathing that the late stages of the disease produced. The death itself was not, according to the witnesses, particularly painful. The pain had been in the months that led up to it. The death itself was in the slight mercy that the long final illness sometimes produces, the release from the pain that the previous months had imposed. She was 52 years old. She had spent 36 of those years in the country she had come to as a 16-year-old in the green silk dress, on the deck of a yacht making its way up the Thames in the early morning of an April day in 1736. By 1771, Augusta was visibly ill. She had lost weight. She was, in her colour, paler than she had been. Her voice, which had been a clear if slightly accented English for the previous 35 years, was now a low rasping voice that had difficulty producing the words she wanted to say. She was eating, by this point, only the softest of foods, prepared in the plain forms that her swallowing could manage. She was, in her appearance, a woman in obvious decline. She did not, however, withdraw from her duties. She continued, for as long as her strength allowed to receive visitors. She continued to attend, when ceremony absolutely required it, the narrow formal occasions of the family. She continued to write, in her own hand, the modest letters of family business that her position required. She kept, for as long as she could, the appearance of a woman who was managing some little temporary indisposition rather than the underlying serious illness that her physicians and her family now privately knew she had. The king visited her constantly during this period. He was, according to those who saw him at her bedside in the last months, deeply distressed by his mother's condition. The dependence that had been the central feature of the relationship for nearly 40 years was now in the imminence of its ending, manifesting itself in the king as a quiet, constant, anxious need to be near her. He came in the mornings, he came in the afternoons, he came in the evenings. He sat with her in the domestic rooms that had been arranged for her at Carlton House. He held her hand. He talked to her in the low, gentle voice that her difficulty in hearing now required. He did not, in the slight recorded fragments that have survived from this period, say anything of any distinct memorability. He simply, in the way of a son with a dying mother, was present, as much as he was able to be, for the long, slow ending that was now in front of them both. Charlotte, in the same period, made her own plain visits, with the same restrained courtesy that had characterized her relationship with Augusta over the previous decade. She came, on the appropriate occasions, with appropriate narrow gifts. She inquired, in the appropriate way, after Augusta's health. She did not, by any account, become a constant presence at the bedside in the way her husband did. The relationship between her and her mother-in-law had not, over the 11 years of their coexistence, developed into the kind of warmth that would have produced that constant presence. But she came, on the days she was supposed to come, and she said the things she was supposed to say, and she was, in the modest public way that the family's situation required, present at the appropriate moments. She did her duty. She did, given the limitations of the relationship as it had actually developed, perhaps slightly more than her duty. There was a personal little fact about Charlotte's relationship with Augusta that the historical record preserves only in glancing references, but that the careful reader can, by paying attention to what is and is not said, piece together. The two women, in spite of the surface civility, never developed any genuine private warmth. There is, in the surviving correspondence on either side, no letter that suggests the confidential exchange that would mark a real friendship. There is, in the recorded conversations of either, no remark about the other that goes beyond the quiet public courtesies that their positions required. Charlotte, in her many letters to her own German relatives and to her own sisters, mentioned her mother-in-law occasionally, but always in the reserved formal way of a junior member of a family, writing about a senior member to whom she owes distant respect. Augusta, in her own correspondence, mentioned her daughter-in-law in the same kind of reserved formal way, with the subtle adjustments of phrasing that the difference in their positions required. The two women, who had spent 11 years in close family proximity, had not, at the end of it, become close. The reasons for the distance have been speculated about by historians. Some have suggested that Augusta found her daughter-in-law a duller and less interesting person than the Dowager Princess herself was, and that the dullness produced, over the years, the kind of slight quiet boredom that prevented the relationship from developing into anything warmer. Some have suggested that Charlotte, watching her husband's continued dependence on his mother across the years of her married life, developed a modest, private resentment of the situation that she was too disciplined to display openly, but that prevented her, internally, from offering Augusta the kind of warmth that a less constrained relationship would have permitted. Some have suggested that the two women were, in their underlying temperaments, simply too similar in some respects and too different in others, both reserved and dignified and disinclined to display their feelings, but reserved and dignified in slightly different ways that did not permit the plain accumulation of confidence that would have been necessary to bridge the gap. The actual truth, like most actual truths in such situations, was probably a narrow combination of all of these factors, with the additional ingredient of the simple bad luck of a relationship that had begun in 1761, with the older woman in possession of the position the younger woman was supposed to be moving into, and that had never, in the 11 years that followed, found its way to the kind of footing that would have allowed the two women to be, in any deep sense, on the same side. Charlotte, after Augusta's death, spoke of her mother-in-law in public with the modest, respectful formulas that the period required, and in private with the same little respectful formulas, and continued to do so for the remaining 46 years of her own long life. The relationship had been what it had been. Charlotte did not, after the death, attempt to retroactively warm it into something it had not been. The relationship between Charlotte and Augusta, in spite of the distant peace that the two women had managed to construct, did contain, beneath the surface formality, an ongoing tension that the household's senior officers were aware of, but that no one, on either side, ever openly acknowledged. The tension was the tension of competing custody of the king's emotional life. Augusta, by virtue of her 33 years as the dominant maternal figure, occupied, by the time of Charlotte's arrival, the principal place in his private affections. Charlotte, by virtue of her position as wife and the production of his children, occupied the principal place in his daily domestic life. The two positions were not, in any obvious sense, mutually exclusive, and most royal husbands of the period would have been able to accommodate both his mother and his wife in different parts of his life without significant difficulty. The king, however, was not most royal husbands. The unusual intensity of his attachment to his mother, which had been formed in the years of his sheltered upbringing and never significantly displaced, meant that the emotional space available for any other woman in his life was, by the private logic of his own internal arrangements, limited. Charlotte, who had hoped on entering the union to develop with her husband the kind of close, intimate companionship that the quiet German principalities of her own background had taught her to value, found instead that the principal confidences of her husband's heart were directed elsewhere. She did not, by any account, complain about this, either openly or in private letters that have survived. She accepted, in the slight composed way of her own local character, the limits of what the marriage could give her. She concentrated, instead, on the parts of the partnership that were within her power to develop, which were the production and care of the children, the management of her own household, and the steady cultivation of her own interests in music and botany and reading. The union by these means became a successful union by the standards of the period, although it was probably not, in either of its parties' private experience, quite the match that either of them had originally hoped for. Augusta, on her side, never relinquished, in the 11 years of overlap, the principal claim on her son's emotional attention. She did not, on the whole, attempt to actively exclude Charlotte. She simply, by the natural operation of the long-established habit, continued to be what she had always been. The result, as we have already noted, was the distant peace that characterized the two women's relationship for the entire period of their coexistence. and that ended only with Augusta's death in February of 1772, when the position of principal woman in the king's emotional life finally, after 34 years, became Charlotte's by default rather than by any positive transfer. She accepted, in her quiet way, the historical fact of the distant peace they had managed, and she moved on, in her later years, as queen of a kingdom that was changing rapidly around her, to the other concerns that her own long life kept producing. In the last months, the two women remained courteous rather than intimate. It was not a warm reconciliation, but it was a workable peace, made by two women who had spent a decade learning the limits of one another. Augusta died on the 8th of February 1772 at Carlton House, in the bedchamber at the back of the principal apartments, in the late evening. She had been, for the previous several days, declining rapidly. She had been, for the previous 24 hours, in and out of a state of consciousness that her physicians described as variable. The final hours, when they came, were not particularly painful, according to those who were present, although the difficulty of breathing that the late stages of her illness had produced gave the dying a plain distressing quality that the king, who was at the bedside, found very hard to watch. He had been there since the early afternoon. He had been informed in the morning that the end was now close. He had come immediately. He had remained with brief intervals for the narrow necessities of his own body, at her side for the rest of the day. Charlotte, who had been informed in the same morning, had come briefly in the early afternoon, had paid her formal respects, had spent a quarter of an hour at the bedside, and had then, in the careful way of her own management of her position, withdrawn to allow her husband the final hours alone with his mother. The king did not, by any account, ask her to stay. The king did not, in the secluded logic of his lifelong relationship with his mother, particularly want anyone else in the room with him in the final hours. The various household officers who had attended the dying came in and out of the room as the hours passed. The senior physician, who was an old family friend of considerable competence, came in periodically to assess the progress of the dying and to consult, in low voices, with the king. The modest attending women of Augusta's household came in to perform the little physical attentions that the dying still required. The chaplain, who had been summoned in the morning, came in and out as the quiet religious offices that the protocol of the death required were performed. Augusta, for most of the afternoon and evening, was no longer in any condition to participate in these offices in any conscious way. She was by the late evening mostly silent, with her eyes closed, with her breathing coming slowly and unevenly. The king sat beside the bed, with her hand in his, and watched her exhalation. The final exhalation came, when it came, as such endings often do. It was simply slightly longer than the moment before it, with no specific drama, with no private distinction that marked it out as different from the other slow last sound of the previous hours. The breathing was followed by no further exhalation. The senior physician, who had been standing at the foot of the bed, watched for some time. He stepped forward. He listened, with his ear over Augusta's chest. He stood up. He looked at the king. He nodded once slightly. The king did not, according to those who were in the room, make any sound. He continued, for some minutes, to hold his mother's hand. He sat, in his chair, with his head slightly bowed, for what one of the witnesses described as a very long quarter of an hour. He then released the hand. He stood up. He turned to the senior officer of the household, who was waiting near the door, and he said, in a voice that the witnesses described as steady but very low, that the necessary arrangements should now be made. He left the room. He went, according to one of the pages who saw him pass. to a slight private room at the end of the corridor, where he remained alone, with the door closed, for nearly an hour. When he came out, he was composed. He gave the various instructions that the death required. He returned by carriage to St. James's Palace, where Charlotte was waiting for him. They sat together in the Queen's apartments in the late hours of the night, with the low fire in the grate burning down and the candles in their holders gradually shortening. They did not, according to the only servant who remained in the room with them, say very much to each other. They were simply, in the way of long-married couples on the night of a major family loss, present together. Charlotte held the king's hand. The king did not weep, but he did not need to. The grief in its slow, steady way was already in the room, and the queen, in her quiet way, was the one who had to hold it. The funeral took place at Westminster Abbey on the 15th of February. The king attended in the principal mourner's position, as he had attended his father's funeral 21 years earlier. He walked the procession with the same composed dutifulness that the boy of 12 had shown on the earlier occasion, although the man of 33 was, by his own internal experience, finding the work much harder than the boy had done. The grandchildren, those of them old enough to attend, walked in their plain mourning clothes behind their father. Charlotte, as the queen, did not walk in the procession, but watched from the narrow gallery that had been arranged for her. The body was interred in due course in the family vault at the abbey, near the body of the husband who had died 21 years before her, and near the bodies of the children of the marriage who had not survived to see this evening's interment. The response to the funeral was, by the standards of royal funerals of the period, muted. There was no great popular outpouring of grief. There was no significant period of court mourning observed by the population at large. The Dowager Princess had been, for so much of her later life, the principal object of popular hostility, that her death did not produce in the open mind the kind of warm, sympathetic response that the death of a more popular figure would have produced. She was buried with the modest, dignified ceremonies that the royal protocol required, and the country, having buried her, moved on to its other concerns within a fortnight. The opposition press, which had been attacking her for 2 decades, made a little effort, in the days after the funeral, to continue the attacks even into the period of mourning. The effort was not, on the whole, successful. There is something about a death, even the death of a long-disliked public figure, that produces in even the most hostile critics a quiet moment of pause, and the pamphlets and prints that had been so aggressive during her lifetime were, in the weeks after her death, mostly quiet. The attacks, when they resumed, were directed at other targets. Augusta, who had been, for so much of her widowhood, the principal object of British political abuse, had passed, with her death, out of the active concerns of the press, and her name receded, over the months and years that followed, into the long historical background from which only the careful attention of later historians has, in modern times, partially retrieved it. We are nearly at the end of our long evening. Let us come back, before we close, to the moments we began with. Let us return to the young woman in the green silk dress, on the deck of the yacht in 1736, with the brown water of the Thames sliding past, with the flat shore of Kent on one side and the flat shore of Essex on the other, with her German waiting woman beside her, and with her slight composed face turned toward the city she had not yet seen. She lived, after that morning, for almost 36 more years. She bore 9 children, who survived to adulthood. She was the wife for 15 years of a difficult man whom she had not chosen and whom she came by the plain accumulations of long marriage to understand and to accept, and in some narrow private way that the documents of her life do not fully record. To love. She was widowed. She raised in her widowhood the boy who would become George III. She conducted, in her long widowhood, the careful, patient management of the household and the modest political role that the situation gave her. She was the principal cultural patron of one of the great botanical institutions of the world. She was the most publicly hated royal woman of her generation, on grounds that the historical record has, in its slow, patient way, considerably modified. She was the mother-in-law of a queen, in a relationship that was always more difficult than either of them publicly acknowledged. She was the mother of a king, in a relationship that was the central emotional fact of both of their lives, and that produced in the king the dependence that no later relationship was ever quite able to displace. She died on the 8th of February 1772, in a bedchamber at the back of Carlton House, with her son sitting beside the bed and her daughter-in-law somewhere else in the building, with the long story that had begun on the deck of the yacht in 1736, having in its little complete form played itself out. The dragons on the pagoda at Kew were still there in their gold and bright colours, for another generation or so before the weather would take them down. The plants she had imported from the quiet expeditions to the colonies were still in the hothouses. The slight library of cultivated correspondence and household accounts she had accumulated was still in the cabinets at Carlton House. The portraits painted at successive stages of her long life were still on the walls of royal palaces, where some of them remain to this day. She had, in her 36 years in England, done what the position into which she had been delivered required her to do. She had managed, with her steady, patient composure, the impossible situations that the position kept presenting her with. She had not, in any obvious sense, been heroic. She had not, in any obvious sense, been particularly virtuous. She had been instead a person of unusual practical competence, exercised quietly on the various ordinary tasks that her ordinary days kept giving her across decades that the rest of British public life experienced as periods of dramatic political conflict. She had for the most part kept her head down. She had kept her family fed. She had kept her son alive and educated to the standard that his eventual position required. She had built a garden that has lasted. She had endured, with very little visible complaint, the worst public abuse that her century directed at any private woman in her position. She had, at the end, died in the bedchamber in the back of her own house, with her son in attendance, in the way that she had probably preferred, on a winter evening in February, with the ordinary household of Carlton House operating around her in the way it had operated for all of the previous 19 years. This is what we have come to follow tonight: the arrival on the yacht, the marriage to the difficult prince, the years at Leicester House with the impossible parents-in-law, the sudden widowhood, the raising of the future king, the quiet partnership with Bute, the ascent to the throne and the ministerial crises that followed, the marriage of the king to Charlotte and the distant peace between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, the garden at Kew, the pagoda, the final illness, the death. The story is the story of a distinct 18th century life, lived under unusual public pressure, in a position that the woman who held it had not asked for and did not, in any visible way, particularly want. That the story is also, in some respects, the story of a personal kind of competence, the sort that is exercised quietly, day after day, for decades, on the ordinary tasks that the days keep producing, without any of the dramatic moments that would have made the competence visible to the outside world. Augusta did not have a life that produced statues. She did not, on the whole, have a life that produced famous portraits in which the painter brought out some sharp quality of character that subsequent generations would recognize as remarkable. She had, instead, A life that produced a long, quiet record of plain, steady management, exercised under conditions that would have broken many other people, and bringing forward into the next generation the narrow, steady establishment that allowed her son to become the king he became, and her grandchildren to become the public figures they became, and her gardens to become the institutions they became. She had been, in some respects, the kind of person whose local gift was the modest, invisible competence that does not produce statues. The competence was real. The competence was, by the little surviving evidence of her actual conduct of her position, considerable. The fact that the competence did not produce, in her own lifetime, the recognition that other less competent figures of her period received, is one of the quiet, ordinary injustices of public life. She had not, in her own life, particularly minded the injustice. She had simply continued in her quiet way to do the work that her position required, and the work, in its slight accumulated form, was what it was. That is the life, that is the story. And the story, in its plain accumulated way, is one of the deeper stories of the British 18th century. Even though the public conversation of the time, which was busy with the more dramatic figures of the period, tended to overlook it in favour of the louder voices around it. The louder voices have mostly faded. The pagoda is still there. The gardens are still there. The line of monarchs that descended from her, through her son and his children and their children, continued through the 19th and 20th centuries to the present occupant of the throne in a continuity that has been, for over 2.5 centuries, unbroken. The light, in the bedchamber at Carlton House, is the light of a winter evening in February 1772. The fire in the grate has burned down. The candles in their holders are mostly extinguished. The king, who has gone to St. James's, has been sitting with his queen for some hours in the queen's apartments, with the slow grief of the night settling around them. The household at Carlton House, in the absence of its mistress, is being reorganised by the senior officers for the practical business of the funeral and the dispersal of the establishment that will follow. The body of Augusta, in the bed at the back of the principal apartments, has been laid out, in the way that the customs of the period required, by the women who had attended her in the last weeks. The careful arrangements that will in due course take her body to the abbey for the funeral are being prepared. She is, in this narrow late hour, in the same bedchamber she has been in for the last few months. The room is quiet. The fire has been kept burning by the women who are still in the household. The candles near the bed are alight. The body, in its plain shift, is at rest. The long story is done. The young woman in the green silk dress on the deck of the yacht in 1736 has, by the slow, modest progression of 36 years, arrived at the end of the road that began on that April morning, and the road, in its long completion, has produced what it has produced. The crowd that had gathered at Greenwich on that April morning of 1736 did not, of course, know any of what was coming. They saw a young woman in a green silk dress come down the gangplank of a yacht. They saw her get into a carriage. They saw the carriage move off. They went back to their ordinary mornings, with the interest in the new princess that they had given to the ceremony quickly displaced by the more pressing business of their own lives. They did not know that the young woman they had briefly seen would, over the course of the next 36 years, bear 9 children, manage 2 royal households, build one of the great gardens of Europe, raise the king who would lose the American colonies, and die, in the end, of throat cancer in a back bedchamber of Carlton House on a winter evening in February. They saw on that morning only the public arrival. The rest of the story was, on that morning, in the future, where stories always are. We, looking back across the centuries, can see the whole of it. The crowd at Greenwich could see only the moment before them, and that ceremony was, for them, sufficient. Sleep well. The fire is burning low. The candles are still lit. The household holds in its slight ordinary way, in spite of the death at its centre. The pagoda at Kew, in the dark gardens at this hour, is standing as it stood when she last saw it, with its painted dragons quiet on their corners, and its plain classical companions in the surrounding plantings keeping their slow vigil. The story, in the narrow, unhurried way of the houses that know how to keep their stories, goes on. The pagoda stands. The gardens keep their shape. The story remains. The candles in the bedchamber at Carlton House are still burning. The household, in the absence of its mistress, keeps vigil through the long late hours of the February night. Good night.